Honestly, if you were to ask me right now to show you pictures from my childhood, I really couldn't give you much. And it's not because we were poor or didn't have cameras, it's just I physically cannot bring myself to keep old digital files anymore. I don't trust them. I don't trust the idea that a piece of silicon and wire can trap a moment in time, because I know for an absolute fact that sometimes when you take a picture of the dark takes a picture of you right back, and it hitches a ride in your pocket. Look, I don't know exactly what year it was, maybe 13 or 14 years ago, back when I was in the 9th grade. My name is Ben, by the way. Back then, my family had this massive tradition of doing these huge summer road trips. We'd pack everyone up and go to coastal towns, down south, everywhere. But the one place we always ended up circling back to was Dalat. If you've never been, Dalat is this mountain town in the highlands, a place completely perpetually swallowed by cold mist, where the pine trees look like jagged black teeth against the night sky, and the roads just twist around these steep, fatal drops. It's beautiful during the day, but at night, the fog literally eats the headlights of your car, and the damp cold just seeps right into your bones. Anyway, this particular summer trip was different because my Uncle Bill came along. Uncle Bill was, well, he was a character. He wasn't some soft suburban dad. The guy was a hardened ex-cop who spent his career in the anti-smuggling division, busting cartels and dealing with the worst kinds of people in the absolute worst kinds of places. He had this massive macho complex, always puffing his chest out, always trying to prove he was the toughest guy in the room. He even carried a handgun with him on family vacations. He later admitted he never actually kept it loaded while traveling with us kids. It was just an intimidation tactic, a metal prop to make him feel invincible. So we were up in Dalat, and we had spent the whole first day doing normal tourist stuff, visiting flower gardens, waterfalls, just a load of crap that teenagers like me found incredibly boring. By the second night, we were all back at the hotel, winding down. It was probably past 10 p.m., just freezing rain outside. I was half asleep when Uncle Bill just starts pounding on our room door. He bursts in, completely restless, and he looks at me and my cousin Brad, his son, who was exactly my age, and he just starts laying into us about how we're acting like old men. He told us to get up, put our coats on, and said he was taking us to the haunted house on the Pren Mountain Pass. Now, even 13 years ago, everyone knew about the Pren Pass house. It's this massive, decaying, French colonial mansion sitting abandoned right on the edge of a winding mountain road. It had a reputation that spanned decades. Stories about people hanging themselves, bodies being dumped in the wells, just pure, concentrated misery. I instantly felt the hairs on my arms stand up. I tried to tell him that going out in the freezing rain at midnight to a condemned building was a terrible idea, but Uncle Bill just laughed. He called us cowards and said it was time to build some character. So, we ended up stuffing 8 people into a single taxi. It was me, Brad, Uncle Bill, another male relative, and a few of the girls in the family. The ride up the mountain pass was suffocating. The heater in the cab smelled like burnt dust, and the fog outside was so thick you couldn't see 3 feet past the windshield. When we finally pulled up to the rusted gates of the mansion, the girls took one look at the pitch-black silhouette of the house looming against the fog and flat out refused to leave the car. I didn't blame them. The place radiated this heavy, nauseating energy, but the 4 of us guys, led by Uncle Bill, stepped out into the freezing mud. Here is something a lot of people don't know about these abandoned sites. They aren't always empty. Sometimes, opportunists squat there. When we walked into the main hall, pushing past a heavy, rotting wooden door, we were greeted by a local couple. They were illegal caretakers, squatters who basically gate-kept the ruins. They made their living by extorting thrill-seekers. If you slipped them some cash, they'd act as tour guides and tell you the gruesome history of the place. Uncle Bill, not wanting to deal with trespass warnings, just peeled off a few $100,000 dong, maybe like 15 or 20 bucks, which was decent money for them, and told the woman to show us around. The woman pulled out this incredibly weak, flickering flashlight, and the tour began. The house smelled like wet decay, rat droppings, and the sickly sweet scent of old, burnt incense. She led us through these cavernous, peeling rooms. In her broken, raspy voice, she pointed to a corner and casually mentioned that a girl had overdosed and died right there. Then she took us to a balcony and claimed a pregnant woman had thrown herself off it. Honestly, it sounded like absolute bullshit. It felt rehearsed, like a theatrical performance meant to justify the $20 we gave her. I was terrified, sure, because the atmosphere was suffocating, but my brain was constantly gaslighting me, telling me that this lady was just a scammer and we were just gullible tourists in a dirty old house. But then, we reached a narrow, crumbling stone staircase leading downwards. The woman stopped dead in her tracks. She turned off her flashlight, plunging us into almost total darkness, and her entire demeanor shifted. The scammer persona dropped completely. She told us, in a very quiet, serious tone, that the basement down there was the only place in the house she refused to enter. She indirectly explained that terrible things happened down there decades ago involving kidnapped girls, and that she and her husband regularly heard muffled crying and scratching sounds coming from beneath the floorboards at night. Uncle Bill just scoffed. He thought it was the grand finale of her little scam. He demanded she open the rusted padlock on the basement door. She aggressively refused, warning us that the entity down there was hostile and highly active. That's when Uncle Bill went full cop mode. He started lecturing her, bragging about his anti-smuggling days. He told her he had spent nights staking out criminal drop points in the middle of massive, overgrown graveyards, sleeping on top of anonymous graves with hundreds of dead bodies beneath him. He practically yelled that he wasn't afraid of a single ghost when he had slept among thousands. He demanded the key again. The woman didn't argue anymore. She just handed it over, her hands shaking, and backed away. Uncle Bill grabbed the rusted key, shoved it into the padlock, and forced it open. The heavy wooden door creaked open, exhaling this breath of air that was so unnaturally freezing, it literally smelled like an open freezer full of spoiled meat. I remember watching him reach into his waistband and pull out his unloaded gun, holding it by his side just to look tough in front of us. He puffed his chest out, gave us a smirk, and took a step down into the pitch-black stairwell. He was out of our sight for maybe 5 seconds. I was standing near the top of the stairs, staring into the dark, expecting him to yell out a joke or try to jump scare us. But the silence was absolutely suffocating until I heard this frantic, heavy scrambling sound, almost like a large animal losing its footing on the stone steps. And the worst part was I could hear his breathing, ragged and desperate, completely void of any of the macho confidence he had just displayed. Uncle Bill burst out of the stairwell, nearly tripping over his own feet. He slammed his shoulder into the doorframe, breathing heavily. I looked at his face in the dim, ambient light, and my stomach instantly tied into knots. The man was completely drenched in cold sweat. His skin was the color of old newspaper, absolutely drained of blood. His eyes were wide, darting around the room, and his hands, the hands of a veteran cop, were trembling so hard that the metal of his gun was clicking against his wedding ring. My cousin Brad asked him what he saw. Uncle Bill blinked hard, swallowed visibly, and forced this incredibly fake, shaky laugh. He hastily put the gun back in his waistband and claimed he was just messing with us, that he ran up just to see if we would get scared. But his voice cracked. He wasn't looking at us. He was staring at the closed basement door. He immediately started walking briskly toward the exit, telling us the tour was over and we needed to leave. But Brad, my cousin, had inherited his dad's stubborn pride. He pulled out his phone, one of those old, bulky Nokia brick phones that had a built-in camera and a blindingly bright xenon flash. He said he wanted to go down and snap a few pictures just to show his friends at school. Uncle Bill froze. He turned around and vehemently forbade Brad from going down there. But Brad challenged him, asking why he couldn't go if there was nothing down there to be afraid of. Uncle Bill was trapped by his own ego. He couldn't admit he ran from something, so he just gritted his teeth, his jaw visibly clenching, and stepped aside, telling Brad to make it quick. Brad jogged down the steps. A second later, A brilliant white flash illuminated the dark stairwell, followed by another. Brad came trotting back up, completely unfazed, holding his Nokia. He looked at the screen and complained that it was just an empty, dirty room with some old makeshift shrines. We left the house immediately. The walk back to the taxi was completely silent. None of us felt victorious. When we got into the cab, the driver tried to start the engine. It sputtered and died. My heart plummeted into my shoes. He tried again. Nothing. The driver muttered something under his breath, visibly panicked, saying he never should have taken a fare to this cursed place. We sat in the freezing car, surrounded by the fog, and I just kept staring at the rear-view mirror, expecting to see something wet and pale crawling out of the mansion gates. After what felt like an eternity, the engine finally roared to life on the 4th try, and we sped down the mountain. Back at the hotel room, the adrenaline started wearing off, and the teenage stupidity kicked in. The guys all gathered around Brad's Nokia to look at the photos. They were blurry, low-resolution shots of a damp concrete basement. In the corner of one of the photos, near a small incense burner, there was this smudge, a hazy, white artifact that looked like a glitch in the pixels. Brad and the other relative thought it was hilarious. They immediately turned on their phone's Bluetooth, because this was before smartphones and cloud sharing, and started slowly transferring the image file to each other's phones. They wanted to use it as proof they survived the haunted house. They asked if I wanted them to beam the photo to my phone. I looked at that smudge on the tiny screen, and my gut completely inverted. Every primal instinct I had screamed at me. I told them no. I told them they were idiots and I wanted absolutely nothing to do with it. I just rolled over in my bed and faced the wall. That night was the longest night of my life. Uncle Bill was sleeping in a separate room with his wife, so it was just us guys in our room. I eventually drifted off, but I kept waking up to the sounds of my cousins tossing and turning. The room felt incredibly heavy, like the air pressure had dropped. I was laying there, paralyzed by the cold, when I heard the distinct sound of the heavy wooden wardrobe doors creaking open on their own, followed by the bathroom faucet slowly turning on, letting out this steady, sickening drip that echoed against the tiles. I squeezed my eyes shut, mentally gaslighting myself, trying to rationalize that the hotel was old, the wind was blowing the doors, the pipes were leaky. But then I heard Brad gasp. He started thrashing in the bed next to mine, whimpering, complaining loudly that someone was yanking the blankets off his legs. The other guy on the floor was making these choked, gagging sounds, like his chest was being crushed. I lay there, completely frozen, sweating through my shirt, praying to whatever was listening that it wouldn't notice me. I was the only one who didn't take the photo, and I was the only one left untouched. When the sun finally came up, the room looked like a disaster area. My cousins were pale, exhausted, and visibly traumatized. They started exchanging notes about the sleep paralysis, the feeling of icy hands wrapping around their ankles, the suffocating weight on their chests. We went down to the hotel restaurant for breakfast. Uncle Bill was already there, drinking black coffee. He looked like he hadn't slept a wink. He had dark purple bags under his eyes. The guys immediately started complaining to him about the haunted hotel room, excitedly telling him about the doors opening and the blankets being pulled. Normally, Uncle Bill would have slapped the table, called them delusional, and told them to man up, but he didn't. He just sat there, staring into his coffee mug, completely silent. Brad, trying to prove he wasn't crazy, pulled out his Nokia and shoved the basement photo in his dad's face. He pointed at the blurry white smudge and said, "Look, we caught it on camera. It followed us." I was watching Uncle Bill's face. The moment his eyes registered that blurry white shape on the screen, his entire demeanor shattered. I saw the skin on his face tighten, his breathing hitched, and the hair on his arms literally stood straight up. He pushed the phone away from him like it was physically burning his hand. He looked at us, his eyes wide and completely defeated. And then, he confessed. He told us that when he walked down those stairs and reached the bottom, he didn't see a blurry smudge. He saw her. He said the air was so cold it burned his lungs. He looked into the corner, by the incense burners, and he saw a young woman crouching on the floor. She was hugging her knees to her chest, her head tucked down. Uncle Bill said she wasn't transparent or ghostly. She looked solid. She looked horrifyingly real. And he could hear her. He heard this wet, agonizing sobbing echoing off the concrete walls. The primal panic kicked in. He said his brain short-circuited. Out of pure, blind survival instinct, he whipped out his gun and aimed it directly at the crouching girl's head, his finger trembling on the trigger, completely forgetting the gun was empty. He said the second he aimed the weapon, the sobbing stopped. The girl slowly started to raise her head, and then, right before his fucking eyes, she just dissolved. She didn't run away. She just started turning into mist, fading into the damp concrete walls over the course of 3 agonizing seconds until the corner was completely empty. That was when he broke and ran up the stairs. He sat there at the breakfast table, an ex-cop who had faced down armed criminals, looking like a terrified child. He admitted he was too ashamed to stop Brad from going down, and he had been silently praying Brad wouldn't see what he saw. The table went dead silent. Nobody ate another bite. We packed up and left a lot that very same morning. But the nightmare didn't stay in the mountains. Over the next 2 days of the road trip, the 3 Nokia phones that had the photo saved on their memory cards started behaving completely erratically. At first, it was just minor glitches. The phones would vibrate violently for no reason when placed on a table. The batteries would drain from full to zero in a matter of minutes. Then, the screen started freezing, and the keypads became completely unresponsive. By the time we crossed the city limits back into our hometown, all 3 phones simultaneously completely bricked themselves. They wouldn't turn on. They wouldn't charge. They were just dead pieces of plastic and metal. My phone, the only one that didn't receive the Bluetooth transfer, worked perfectly fine. When they took the phones to a repair shop a few days later, the technicians were baffled. They said the hardware seemed fine, but the internal software was completely corrupted, violently scrambled by something they couldn't explain. The only way to make the phones usable again was to perform a deep, factory-level wipe of the hard drives. They had to delete everything, every text message, every contact, and every single photograph taken on that trip. They wiped the phones, and magically, they turned back on. But Brad and my other cousin couldn't look at the devices the same way anymore. They ended up selling them to a pawn shop the very next week at a massive loss. Looking back now, as an adult, I constantly think about the mechanics of what happened. I think about how a digital camera captures light, and how Bluetooth transfers data through invisible radio waves in the air. We wiped the hard drives, sure. We deleted the zeros and ones that made up her blurry image. But sometimes, when I'm lying in bed and my own house settles, making the wardrobe creak, I stare at the dark corner of my bedroom. I can't help but wonder. When you delete a digital file of something that shouldn't exist, does it really just go away? Or did we just destroy the cage, leaving whatever hitched a ride in that Nokia phone completely free to roam wherever it wants? I really don't know the answer. And honestly, I pray to God I never find out. You know how everyone hypes up moving into your first college apartment? You think it's going to be this amazing, independent era. Spoiler alert, nobody warns you how fast that dream can turn into a literal freaking nightmare. This happened back in 2019, my freshman year of college. I grew up in a pretty comfortable household down in the provinces. My parents owned some agricultural factories, so we weren't struggling. When I got accepted into a university in Saigona, city so loud, fast and crowded it kind of swallows you whole, my parents went all out to make sure I was safe. They bought me a nice scooter, set me up in a secure dorm, and sent me a really generous allowance, like $400 a month, which is massive for a college student here. Because I was so sheltered, I was incredibly naive. I didn't know how to read people. I didn't understand the darker, messier sides of life. When I moved into the dorms, I was randomly paired with an older girl. I'll call her Naya. What you gotta understand about Naya is that she was the definition of tough. She was a year older than me, but she felt 10 years older. She wore her hair pulled back tight, dressed a bit tomboyish, and had this fiercely protective energy. She was grinding her way through school, working late-night shifts as a beer promoter at some damn sketchy local bars just to pay her tuition. For the first 6 months, she took me under her wing. She became my big sister. She'd make sure I was eating right, give me advice, and genuinely cared about me. She never took advantage of my money either. If she borrowed $20 to cover a bill, she worked an extra shift and paid me back immediately. I adored her. So, when she told me she had to move out of the dorms, I was crushed. Her shifts ended at midnight, and the dorms locked their gates at 10 p.m. It just wasn't working. She asked if I wanted to leave the dorms and get an apartment with her. I wanted the freedom, and honestly, I just wanted to stay with my big sister. She was looking at these tiny, run-down, cheap rooms. I told her absolutely not. With my allowance, I told her we should get a nicer, bigger place with a loft, and I'd cover 2/3 of the rent. She was hesitant, but she eventually agreed. For the first few months, it was great, pure college freedom. But there was this one quirk about Naya that started to stick out. Whenever we were just hanging out, drinking tea late at night, she would always bring up her little brother. He lived back in Long An. According to Naya, he was 6 years old and the absolute light of her life. She'd constantly tell me, smiling at her phone, that she had just sent her mom some money to buy him a few new outfits. At first I thought it was sweet, but then it kept happening. Every single week she was sending money home, specifically for his clothes. I remember sitting on my loft bed one night, listening to the hum of our cheap desk fan, thinking about it. If it was a teenage girl, sure, maybe she's buying makeup and fast fashion. But a 6-year-old boy? Why does a kid need brand new clothes every 5 days? I even offered to buy him a toy once, but she got weirdly defensive and brushed it off. She'd go home for quick visits, sometimes just leaving in the morning and coming back the same night, and she'd come back glowing, talking about how he hugged her and played with her. But whenever I asked to see a recent picture or a video of him, she always had some excuse ready, claiming he would run away from the camera, or that her phone had magically just died. The crazy part is, I just gaslit myself into thinking it was normal. I didn't want to judge her. Then came the turning point. Naya told me she had to go back to Long An for 3 days. It was a family memorial, a death anniversary for a relative. She told me to just keep the doors locked, looking unusually stressed out about it. While she was gone, I tried calling her on video chat. I was bored, eating instant noodles, and casually told her to point the camera at her brother so I could finally see the kid. She immediately hung up. A minute later, she texted me saying the connection was bad. I felt this weird chill crawl up the back of my neck. Why was she hiding him? When she came back to our apartment after those 3 days, the vibe shifted completely. The air in our room felt thick, heavy, like right before a thunderstorm hits. We had this setup where I slept up on the wooden loft, and she slept on a thick mattress on the ground floor. For 3 nights in a row, I couldn't sleep. The apartment was completely dark, save for the orange glow of the streetlights filtering through the cheap blinds. In the dead of night, I started hearing her whisper. It wasn't sleep talking, it was a hushed, coherent conversation. I laid up there, staring at the ceiling, straining my ears over the sound of the ceiling fan. I heard her whispering into the dark, telling someone to shush and go to sleep, warning them not to bother me because I was sleeping, and threatening to send them back home if they didn't behave. It scared the absolute crap out of me. I pulled my blanket up to my chin. The next morning I tried to laugh it off and asked who she had been talking to last night, joking about whether she had snuck a secret boyfriend over. She didn't even smile. She just poured her coffee and flatly stated that it was just her little brother who missed her so much since she visited, claiming he would throw tantrums and steal her mom's phone to call her on Zalo in the middle of the night, so she was just telling him to go to sleep. It sounded completely logical. It made perfect sense, but my gut was screaming that something was fundamentally wrong. The climax of all this, God, I still get chest pains thinking about it. It was maybe 2 a.m. I woke up needing to use the bathroom. I was groggy, barely opening my eyes. I swung my legs over the edge of the loft, my feet finding the wooden rungs of the ladder. I was halfway down. I paused, just out of habit, and looked down at Nea's mattress. My blood turned to ice. My lungs seized up. I couldn't even draw breath to scream. Nea was asleep, lying on her side, facing away from the ladder. Sitting directly on her hip, straddling her waist, was a child. It was a little boy, but he didn't look right. He didn't look human. His skin was this chalky, unnatural white, and his eyes were way too large, staring blankly at the wall. But the most horrifying part was what he was wearing. It was a stiff, brightly colored, heavily patterned outfit. It looked exactly like, you know that paper? The joss paper, the spirit money that people burn at temples to send goods to the dead in the afterlife? He was wearing clothes made entirely of that stiff, burning paper. I was completely paralyzed on the ladder. My grip on the wood was so tight my knuckles ached. I tried to slowly, silently climb back up and just back away into the dark, but as I shifted my weight, the wooden ladder gave this agonizingly loud creak that seemed to pierce right through the dead silence of the room. And instantly the boy's head snapped around so he could look right at me. His lips stretched into this impossibly wide, terrifying smile. And then, he slipped off Nea's hip. He hit the floor without making a single sound, and he started crawling toward the ladder. He moved so fast, his limbs skittering across the tiles, his unblinking eyes locked on mine, smiling that horrible smile. He grabbed the bottom rung of the ladder. I completely lost it, screaming hysterically for Nea to help me while I scrambled up the rest of the way and throwing myself into the furthest corner of my loft, burying my head in my blanket, sobbing hysterically. I heard Nea bolt upright, frantically asking me what it was and what was wrong. She scrambled up the ladder, turning on the lights. The boy was gone. It was just me, shaking like a leaf. I sobbed, practically hyperventilating, blurting out that there was a fucking ghost of a little boy sitting right on her, trying to explain that he was wearing paper clothes and had a shaved head with a little tuft of hair in the middle before he crawled right at me. I wasn't putting the pieces together. I was just describing the monster I saw. But as I described him, the hair, the round face, the paper clothes, Nea's face just crumpled. All the color drained from her cheeks. She collapsed onto my mattress and started wailing. Not just crying. It was the guttural, agonizing scream of a mother who just lost a child. She started sobbing, rocking back and forth and tearing at her own hair, apologizing profusely and rambling about how he was just clinging to her so much at home that she felt bad for him, admitting she had told him he could follow her back to the city for a few days, but swearing she had told him to behave and that she was taking him back this weekend. I just sat there, my brain short-circuiting, asking her what on earth she was talking about and who she meant. She choked out that it was her brother, her face buried in her hands. I stammered back that her brother was alive, reminding her that she bought him clothes all the time. She looked up at me, her eyes bloodshot and completely hollow, and confessed that he had died a year ago after getting hit by a truck in front of their house, and that the memorial she went to was actually the first anniversary of his death. The room started spinning. Everything clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The clothes she was buying every week. She wasn't buying real clothes. She was taking her hard-earned money, buying stacks of paper spirit clothes, and burning them so he would have something to wear in the afterlife. The late-night phone calls, the whispering in the dark. I spent the rest of the night just holding her while she cried. I thought, okay, she's finally grieving. She finally admitted it out loud. But the next morning was the most terrifying part of all. I woke up, my eyes swollen from crying. Nea was in the kitchenette cooking eggs. She turned to me, completely calm, and smiled. She greeted me with a perfectly normal voice, casually mentioning that she thought she was going to send her mom another $20 this week, because her little brother had said he wanted some new toys last night, brushing it off like kids always wanted more. I stared at her. The delusion had completely re-swallowed her. Her mind couldn't handle the reality, so it just erased last night entirely. I stared at her, horrified, and whispered that her brother was dead. Her eyes flashed with a sudden, vicious anger. She pointed a spatula at me, her face twisting into something ugly. "Don't you ever fucking say that," she hissed. "I don't like it when you say that. He is fine." That was the moment I realized I wasn't safe. She wasn't just haunted by a ghost. Her mind was fractured. And looking back, I realized why she treated me so well, why she was so overprotective. She had projected all her desperate, suffocating need to be a big sister onto me. She was using me to fill the void of a dead child. I didn't argue. I waited until she left for her shift at the bar. Then, I packed every single thing I owned into trash bags, called a cab, and fled right back to the campus dormitories. The aftermath was exhausting. When she realized I was gone, she didn't get angry. She just completely unraveled. She blew up my phone with hundreds of texts begging me to come back, saying she couldn't live without me, and that since she already lost him, she couldn't lose me too, promising he wouldn't scare me again, and pleading that she would send him away. I had to block her on everything. Phone, Zalo, Facebook. She even showed up at the gates of my dorm, pacing back and forth, begging the security guards to let her in, waiting for me to come outside so she could buy me dinner. I hid in my room for months. Eventually, she stopped coming around. I don't know if she dropped out, moved back to her province, or if her mind just completely shattered. Sometimes, late at night when my apartment is dead quiet, my brain forces me to think about that last frantic text she sent me, the one where she promised, "I'll send him away." It messes with my head, because how exactly do you banish something that is only kept alive by your own suffocating grief? I've always been the funny friend. You know the type. I'm the guy who can turn a trip to the grocery store into a 20-minute stand-up routine. I'm gay, I'm loud, and I have absolutely no filter. Making people laugh is just my default setting. Before 2016, I didn't believe in ghosts. I grew up in the countryside hearing all the old wives' tales, but I moved to the city, got a job at a factory, and lived in a tiny 15-square-meter apartment for 3 years without experiencing a single bump in the night. I figured the supernatural just wasn't interested in me. But it turns out, the dead get bored just like the rest of us. That year, my friends and I decided to go camping. One of the guys knew a spot near a shallow stream, backed up against a dense, overgrown patch of woods outside the city. We packed up our motorbikes on a Saturday morning and headed out. The moment we set up the tents, the drinking and the roasting started. We were loud, extremely loud. I was in rare form that afternoon, doing impressions of our terrible boss, telling embarrassing dating stories, just completely holding court. At one point, my friend slapped my shoulder laughing so hard he was crying, swearing to God that I, Han, needed to be a comedian, joking that I could tell a story about a funeral and make it hilarious to the point where even the ghosts would be laughing at my jokes. I puffed out my chest and flipped my hair, bragging that if a ghost came near me, they wouldn't haunt me, but instead they'd buy a front row ticket to my show. We all cracked up, but around 5 p.m., the sun started to dip below the tree line, casting these long, jagged shadows across our campsite. I got a phone call from my mom, so I walked away from the noisy fire to get some quiet. I was pacing back and forth near the edge of the woods, nodding along to my mom complaining about the neighbors, when I looked up. Standing about 30 feet away, perfectly still between two thick trees, was a woman. She was wearing a faded, pale pink dress. Her hair was styled in an old-fashioned way, parted deeply on the side, a 70-30 split that hung heavy over her right eye. She was just standing there, her hands clasped in front of her, watching me. I paused my conversation. I assumed she was a local from a nearby farm who had wandered out because of our noise. I gave her a polite, quick nod of acknowledgement. She didn't react. She just kept staring. I finished my call and walked back to the fire. I grabbed a beer and casually mentioned to my friends that we probably needed to keep it down because some lady in a pink dress was standing in the trees watching us. My friend looked around the dark tree line and frowned, asking if I was already drunk, Han, pointing out that there were no houses out here for miles, and we were in the middle of nowhere. I insisted I saw her, but they just brushed it off. I figured she had walked away. That night we crammed into our tents. I was exhausted, but I'm a light sleeper. Sometime deep in the night, the temperature plummeted. The air inside the tent felt unnaturally heavy. I opened my eyes in the pitch black. The moonlight was casting a faint glow against the thin nylon of our tent, and projected onto that nylon, crisp and clear, was a shadow. It was the silhouette of a person slowly pacing in a tight circle around our tent, a relentless, silent stepping motion that didn't make a single sound on the dry leaves outside, as it just kept looping and looping around us. I closed my eyes tight, convincing myself it was just one of the guys going to the bathroom, and eventually fell back asleep. The next morning we packed up to leave. We were riding our motorbikes back down the dirt path toward the highway. I was riding on the back of my friend's bike. I glanced back toward the tree line one last time. She was standing right at the edge of the woods, the woman in the pink dress. I tapped my friend frantically on the shoulder, desperately telling him to look at the lady in pink that I had warned them about. He slowed the bike down and craned his neck to look, muttering that he didn't see anyone. I pointed directly at her, but when my eyes focused back on the spot, she was gone. She didn't walk behind a tree. She just ceased to exist. My friend called me an idiot, and we drove back to the city. I went back to my normal life. I lived alone in my tiny apartment. I worked a rotating shift, and that week, I was scheduled for the graveyard shift. I'd work all night, come home at 7 a.m., and sleep through the day. Because I was sleeping when the sun was up, I didn't notice anything weird, except for the temperature. It was April. In Saigon, April is a blistering, humid oven. But every time I walked into my apartment, it felt like stepping into a meat locker. A deep, bone-chilling cold that didn't make any sense. The weekend finally arrived. I didn't have to work the night shift. I spent Sunday evening lying on my folding mattress on the floor, watching TV. My room was simple. The mattress, a small bedside table, and the TV mounted on the wall. Around midnight, I turned the TV off. I placed the remote control squarely in the center of the bedside table, pulled the blanket up to my chin, and closed my eyes. I was just drifting off when I heard a loud clack. My eyes snapped open. The TV was on, blaring static snow, and the remote control was lying on the floor, 3 feet away from the table. I froze. My brain frantically searched for logic. Rats, I thought. Some damn rat bumped the remote off the table, and it hit a button. I slowly reached out of my blanket, picked up the remote, aimed it at the TV, and hit the power button. The screen went black. I reached over to place the remote back on the bedside table. As my hand moved over the surface of the table, my knuckles brushed against something. It was soft, and it was freezing cold. It felt exactly like grazing the skin of a frozen chicken at the grocery store. I gasped and yanked my hand back. I slowly turned my head toward the table in the dark. Standing perfectly still on top of my small bedside table were 2 bare, pale feet. It scared the absolute crap out of me. My breath caught in my throat. I slowly tilted my head up, my eyes tracing up the legs, up the pale pink dress, to the face looking down at me in the dark. It was her, the woman from the woods. I didn't scream. I scrambled backward across the floor like a terrified crab, hit the wall, and slapped the light switch. The harsh fluorescent bulb flickered on. The room was completely empty. I sat against the wall, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. My chest hurt. I was hyperventilating, staring at the empty table. "You're hallucinating," I told myself. "You worked the night shift all week. You're exhausted. You're losing your mind." I refused to turn the light off. I sat huddled in the corner until the sun came up, too terrified to move. The next week, I switched back to the day shift. By Tuesday, I had convinced myself the woman on the table was just a severe sleep paralysis hallucination. Tuesday night, I watched TV, turned it off, and laid down. But this time, just to be safe, I didn't put the remote on the table. I tucked it under my pillow. I fell asleep. At exactly 2 a.m., I jolted awake. I didn't hear a crash, but instead I heard this agonizingly slow rhythm of fingernails gently drumming against wood, a methodical tapping sound that was coming directly from the bedside table right next to my head. I slowly, agonizingly turned my head. She wasn't standing on the table this time. She was sitting on it. She was leaning forward, her elbow resting on her knee. her fingers lazily tapping the wood in a continuous, maddening rhythm. She was wearing the pink dress. Her hair was parted in that heavy 70-30 split. The larger section of hair hung down, covering the right side of her face, but her left eye was visible, and she was staring directly at me. She didn't look angry. She didn't look horrifying. She just looked incredibly, intensely curious. She tilted her head, the hair shifting slightly, and she smiled. It was a small, quiet smile. Then, she effortlessly hopped off the table. She crouched down right next to my mattress, bringing her face inches from mine. She opened her mouth to speak. I didn't hear what she said. The sheer, overwhelming terror of a ghost invading my personal space short-circuited my brain. My vision tunneled, the room spun, and I completely passed out. I don't know how long I was unconscious. I groaned, my eyes fluttering open to the sound of a voice echoing inside my head, bluntly telling me to wake up and stop fainting. She was still there, crouched right next to my face. The ends of her cold hair were brushing against my cheek. The voice echoed again, perfectly normal, demanding to know why I had passed out when she hadn't even done anything to me. I shrieked, kicking my legs wildly, screaming internally about what the fuck was happening, and scrambled backward. My foot caught on a bunched-up towel on the floor. I slipped, my head slammed violently against the wall, and I knocked myself out for a second time. When I woke up, it was 4 a.m. The room was empty. I didn't wait around. I grabbed my keys, ran out of the apartment, and sat in a 24-hour coffee shop until it was time to go to work. When I got to the factory, I looked terrible. My coworkers asked what happened, and I spilled everything. I told them about the woods, the table, the tapping. One of the older women pulled me aside and grimly explained that I, Han, had brought something back from the forest, advising me to buy some fruit, light some incense in my room, and apologize, telling it I was just a poor worker trying to survive so it would leave me alone. I did exactly what she said. After work, I bought apples and mangoes, set up a small makeshift altar on my table, and lit 3 sticks of incense. I bowed deeply, begging the empty room to forgive me if I had offended her, pleading that I was just a guy from the province trying to make a living, and desperately asking her to take the fruit and leave me in peace without scaring me anymore. I left the lights on and got into bed. I was exhausted. I closed my eyes and drifted off. I woke up suddenly. The room was pitch black. The lights had been turned off, and the silence was immediately broken by that same slow, deliberate tapping of fingernails against wood. I froze. I slowly turned my head toward the table. She was sitting there again. Her voice echoed in my head again, almost sounding embarrassed as she looked away at the blank wall, explaining that she wasn't trying to scare me and making the chilling point that if she wanted to hurt me, I wouldn't be breathing right now. I swallowed hard, terrified to move. She quietly confessed that she just wanted to hear my stories, explaining that I had made my friends laugh so hard in the forest, and she had been in those woods for so long, enduring such absolute lonely silence that she just wanted to follow me to laugh again, pleading with her one visible eye for me not to be scared and to just tell her a story. I lay there completely paralyzed, my voice shaking as I stammered out a question, asking if she was the lady from the woods. She hopped off the table and sat cross-legged on the floor next to me, eagerly confirming that she was, and enthusiastically demanding that I tell her one of my good jokes right then and there. Tears welled up in my eyes as I cried out that I couldn't, admitting that I was too terrified. My brain was completely empty, and I didn't know any jokes. Her expression instantly hardened, the temperature in the room plummeting as her voice dropped an octave into something cold and terrifying, commanding me to sit up and tell her a story immediately. My body moved before my brain could process it. I shot up into a sitting position, my back rigid against the wall. I was sitting face to face with a dead woman, and she was demanding entertainment. I panicked. I started rambling. I didn't tell a joke. I just started frantically recounting a stupid story about a pig escaping on my uncle's farm back in my hometown. I was stuttering, sweating profusely, talking a mile a minute, and she laughed. It wasn't a creepy, echoing ghost laugh. It was a genuine bright chuckle, She clapped her cold hands together, genuinely amused, exclaiming how funny it was and eagerly asking what happened next. I sat there in the dark for an hour, telling this ghost every mundane, mildly amusing story I could scrape from my memory, and she sat there listening intently, giggling at the right parts. Finally, she sighed, looking content, and decided that it was good enough, telling me to sleep and rest my voice so I could tell her more the next day. The moment she said that, an overwhelming wave of exhaustion hit me. I literally slumped over sideways onto my mattress and fell instantly into a deep sleep. I woke up the next morning, the sun streaming through the window. I sat up, clutching my head. Did I just do an open mic set for a ghost? I went to work and told my friends. They laughed in my face. They told me I was losing my mind, that I should go see a psychiatrist. Nobody believed me. But that night, she came back. I was asleep when I felt a freezing cold weight pressing into my shoulder. Prod, prod, prod. I opened my eyes. She was sitting on the table, stretching her bare foot out and gently kicking my shoulder, cheerfully telling me to wake up because it was story time. I sat up, and the craziest thing happened. I wasn't scared anymore. The sheer absurdity of the situation overpowered the terror. I started talking. I told her about the ridiculous things my coworkers said that day. I gossiped. I complained about my boss. She laughed, and slowly, insanely, I found myself laughing with her. I was sitting in a dark room, laughing with a ghost. This became my life for an entire month. Every single night I was home, she would wake me up, and we would talk. She never drained my energy. I never felt sick or cursed. I actually felt completely fine. We became roommates, friends, even, and she looked out for me. One afternoon, I was pulling my motorbike out of a blind alley. I was just about to merge onto the main road when I heard her voice scream in my ear, "Stop." I slammed on the brakes. A split second later, a massive delivery truck blew through the intersection, swerving wildly into my lane. If I had pulled out, I would have been crushed instantly. Another time, I opened my motorbike trunk and found my wallet sitting inside. I hadn't put it there. That night, she appeared looking incredibly annoyed, scolding me for dropping it in the parking lot like a damn idiot, and lecturing me that if she hadn't picked it up and phased it into my trunk, I would have lost my ID and all my cash, sternly telling me to pay attention. She was a ghost, but she was basically acting like my nagging older sister. Then things got serious. I got a call from my hometown. My mom had fallen from a loft and shattered her leg. She needed surgery immediately. I drained my savings, but I was still short about 2 million dong, roughly $100. I had to beg and borrow from my coworkers just to cover the freaking hospital deposit. I took a bus back to my hometown and spent the night sleeping on a stiff cot in my mom's hospital room. That night, she appeared in the hospital room. She looked at me expectantly. I whispered to her, utterly exhausted and stressed out, explaining that I couldn't do it tonight because my mom was hurt. I was completely broke and in debt, and I just didn't have any funny stories left in me. She looked at me, her expression softening. She floated closer and whispered for me to listen carefully, instructing me to play the lottery the next day with a specific sequence of digits she recited, promising that I would win, and telling me to use the money to pay back my friends and buy my mother good food. She vanished. The next morning, I told my dad about the dream. My dad, being a superstitious countryside man, didn't question it. He went out and bought the ticket. That afternoon, we won 4 million dong, roughly $200, which was exactly double what I needed. A few weeks later, my mom was recovering, and I went back to my apartment in the city. The ghost was waiting for me. I thanked her profusely, and we went back to our routine of late-night storytelling. One night, while we were laughing, I casually asked her what her name was and where she had lived before she passed away. Instantly, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Her smile vanished. The temperature dropped. She looked down at her hands, her shoulders slumping, her voice trembling. She whispered that she didn't know, admitting she couldn't remember her name or where she lived, only remembering dying and then being trapped in those woods for years of absolute, agonizing silence and loneliness. until I came along. My heart breaking for her, I gently asked if she remembered how she died. She looked up at me. A single freezing tear rolled down her pale cheek as she sobbed, burying her face in her hands, and recounted the horrific memory of going out there to work, only for 3 men to drag her into the trees, hurt her terribly, and leave her in the dirt to die all alone in the cold. She wept, a hollow, echoing sound of pure, forgotten agony. Then, she faded away. I woke up crying. The tragedy of it was suffocating. She didn't want revenge. She was just a broken, forgotten girl who had been murdered and left to rot, and all she wanted was someone to talk to. For 3 nights after that, she didn't appear. I started to panic. I felt a deep, genuine guilt for asking her and bringing up that trauma. I did something incredibly stupid. On my day off, I bought a bag of fruit and rode my motorbike all the way back out to those woods alone. I set up the fruit by the tree line, lit the incense, and sat in the dirt. I called out into the quiet trees, desperately apologizing and admitting I shouldn't have asked, pleading with her to come back and promising I didn't mean to make her sad. The incense burned all the way down to the ash. Nothing happened. I rode home feeling defeated. But that night, she appeared in my room. I was so relieved I actually tried to hug her, but my arms just phased through cold air. I apologized again. She smiled sadly and reassured me it was okay, confessing that she just hadn't thought about the pain in a long time, and it had completely overwhelmed her. I asked her if she wanted to move on and reincarnate, offering to go to a temple to talk to the monks so we could help her cross over. She looked at me for a long time, then slowly nodded. The next day, I went to a large Buddhist temple near my factory. I sat down with the head monk and told him the entire, insane story. The monk nodded slowly, explaining that I shared a karmic bond with this spirit, clarifying that she wasn't a vengeful ghost, but rather a lost soul, anchored by loneliness and trauma. And since I had brought her joy and anchored her to me, I now had to guide her to the light. He handed me a specific sutra book and instructed me to read it aloud in my room every night so she could listen. I took the book home. That night, when she appeared, I didn't tell a joke. I opened the book and started chanting the sutras. She sat cross-legged on the floor, listening intently. We did this for weeks. Every night, I would chant, and she would listen. I could see her silhouette becoming fainter, lighter, less tethered to the physical world. Finally, one night she appeared, and the room didn't get cold. The pale blue light was gone. She looked radiant, peaceful. She smiled, her voice sounding light and airy as she thanked me, Han, telling me she could finally see the path and that she was leaving tonight. I felt a massive lump form in my throat. I was losing my friend. She softly asked me to tell her one last funny story so she could leave with a smile. I fought back tears. I cracked a joke about my terrible boss. We laughed. We laughed until we both started crying. She whispered her goodbyes, calling me her little brother, telling me I had brought light into a very dark place and had good karma, promising that I would live a long, happy life and that she would always watch over me. A brilliant, warm light flooded the room from above. She looked up at it, smiled at me one last time, and slowly dissolved into the light like mist in the morning sun. I woke up, my face completely drenched in tears. I went back to the temple the next day. The monk confirmed it. She had crossed over. She was finally free from the pain of those woods. I still live in the city. I still tell jokes. But sometimes, when I get a really good laugh out of a crowd, I look toward the back of the room. I look to see if there's a woman with her hair parted on the side, standing in the shadows, laughing along. To be completely honest with you, whenever I look back at the early 2000s, I don't feel any of that warm, fuzzy nostalgia that most people talk about. I don't think about the simple life or the quiet countryside. All I feel is a deep, nauseating knot in the pit of my stomach. I tell you this because there are certain mistakes you can make when you are young and arrogant that don't just leave a scar on your body. They fundamentally break your understanding of how the world works. They strip away that comfortable illusion that you are safe in the dark. Back then, in my rural village, there was this massive trend going around. When the sun went down, guys would grab these heavy-duty flashlights and head out into the night to catch sparrows. It sounds mundane, I know, but these birds would roost in the thick vegetation, and if you blinded them with the light, you could snatch them right off the branches. People did it to roast them, or to sell them for a few bucks to the local eateries. And I was young, broke, and incredibly greedy. I wanted that easy money. So, I rallied a group of my buddies, maybe 5 or 7 of us, and we headed down to this specific stretch of land right along the river. It was a dense mulberry grove. You have to understand the geography here. This wasn't a neatly trimmed orchard. It was a wild, overgrown nightmare of tangled branches and thick leaves that practically swallowed the moonlight. The soil near the water was always slick, always reeking of decaying roots and wet earth. We got there, and it was like hitting the jackpot. The branches were heavy with sleeping birds. We immediately split up, fanning out into the darkness, completely driven by the thrill of the catch. I was just grabbing them, shoving them into my burlap sack, moving deeper and deeper into the thicket. I didn't even care that the thorns were tearing at my clothes. A good hour must have passed in this weird, obsessive haze. My sack was practically bursting. It was heavy, and I was sweating through my shirt, feeling pretty damn proud of myself. I finally stopped, wiped the grime off my forehead, and turned around to call out to my friends so we could head back. Silence. Just the heavy, oppressive sound of the river washing against the muddy bank. I swept my flashlight around. Nothing. The grove was completely empty. It didn't make any sense. We had been right next to each other. A prickle of unease started at the base of my neck. I started trudging back toward the main path, my boots sinking into the wet mud with every step. That was when I caught a glimpse of a pale light flickering through the leaves, further down the bank. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding, assuming it was just my buddies trying to mess with me, or maybe another group of bird catchers. I started walking toward the light, but as I got closer, the air seemed to grow heavier. It felt hard to breathe, like the oxygen was being sucked out of the space around me. Then, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic rustling coming from directly behind me, sounding like wet fabric swishing against the leaves, and I spun around, aiming my beam into the brush. Part of me immediately tried to rationalize it. My brain was desperately scrambling for a logical explanation. I saw a figure, dressed in something completely white, darting behind a thick cluster of mulberry bushes. I called out, asking if they were out here catching birds too, or if it was one of my idiot friends trying to pull a prank. I even tried to sound tough, demanding they show themselves. Look, back then, I didn't believe in the paranormal. I thought ghosts were just campfire stories meant to scare children. I had never encountered anything unexplainable, so my default state was annoyance, not terror. The figure kept peeking out from behind the leaves, just shifting back and forth, popping out, sliding back in. I squinted, trying to make out the details. It was definitely a woman. She had this incredibly long, dark hair that hung down in tangled sheets, but there was something deeply, profoundly wrong with the way she was moving. She was shifting out from behind the tree and then retreating, but there was absolutely no sound of footsteps, no crunching of dead leaves, no squelching of mud. I lowered the beam of my flashlight toward the ground. My stomach completely dropped out from under me. There was a solid gap of empty space between the hem of her white dress and the muddy earth. She wasn't standing. She was hovering, suspended in the air like a grotesque puppet on invisible strings, just swaying back and forth in the dark. Every single survival instinct in my body fired off at once. The rational part of my brain just short-circuited. I dropped the sack of birds and ran. I tore through that grove like a wild animal. Branches whipped across my face, tearing at my skin, but I didn't feel the pain. I kept throwing panicked glances over my shoulder, and that was the worst mistake I could have made. She was following me. But she wasn't running. She was aggressively zigzagging through the trees, darting into the foliage and instantly materializing closer, popping out from behind trunks, playing this sickening game of cat and mouse. It was like she was mocking my desperate attempt to escape. I was hyperventilating, my chest burning, just blind panic driving my legs. I wasn't looking at the ground. My foot caught hard on a raised mound of earth, and I pitched forward, tumbling down the steep embankment and plunging straight into the freezing river. I thrashed in the dark water, swallowing mouthfuls of river muck, convinced that at any second, cold, dead hands were going to grab my ankles and drag me under. The splashing must have been incredibly loud, because suddenly, flashlight beams cut through the darkness from the top of the bank. It was my friends. They scrambled down and hauled me out of the water, dragging me onto the mud, shivering and coughing up water. The moment I caught my breath, the fear morphed into furious adrenaline. I started cursing them out, demanding to know where the hell they had been and why they had abandoned me. They just looked at me with genuine confusion. They swore up and down that they had been searching the entire grove for me for the past 20 minutes. They said they had walked right through the exact spot where I had been standing, shining their lights everywhere, but they couldn't see me. It was a localized distortion. Whatever that thing was, it had literally hidden me from plain sight. It had placed a veil over me, so it could hunt me in private. Sitting there, soaked to the bone and shivering, a heavy realization washed over me. I wanted to tell them. I desperately wanted to scream about the floating woman in the white dress, but the toxic pride of a teenage boy won out. I didn't want to be the coward who hallucinated a ghost and fell into the river. So, I swallowed the terror, blamed it on tripping in the dark, and kept my mouth shut. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought if I ignored it, the nightmare would just fade away. A week bled by. It was a Saturday evening, and our entire friend group was heading out to celebrate a birthday. It was for a girl in our village, let's call her Me. I had this massive, pathetic crush on her at the time, the kind where you would do absolutely anything just to get a few seconds of her attention. There were about 10 of us, walking in a large group toward the venue. To get there, we had to take the dirt path that skirted right past the river, right past the mulberry grove. As we approached the area, one of the guys started complaining about the walk. He suggested we just ditch the original plan, lay down some tarps right there on the riverbank, build a fire, catch some birds, and have our own private party. The moment he said that, a cold sweat broke out across my back. The memory of that pale, hovering figure hit me like a physical punch. I immediately pushed back, trying to come up with any excuse to keep moving. I argued that the birds wouldn't even be asleep yet, that we'd be sitting in the dark for hours for no reason. But then I looked at Me. Her eyes were lit up with excitement. She loved the idea of a spontaneous bonfire under the stars. She looked at me, almost pleadingly, and because I was an absolute idiot, driven by hormones and a desperate need to impress a girl, I caved. I actively suppressed my own survival instincts for a chance to look cool. We laid out the plastic sheets. We gathered deadwood and got a fire going. Someone made a run back to the village and brought back a huge crate of cheap draft beer. The night was actually going well. We were drinking, laughing, playing stupid party games. As the alcohol started to hit, the games turned into dares. Typical teenage bravado. Eventually, the attention turned to me. One of the older guys in the group pointed a beer bottle toward the edge of the grove, where the shadows were the thickest. He pointed specifically to a lumpy, overgrown mound of dirt near the water. He told everyone that the mound wasn't just dirt. It was an unmarked grave. A dumping ground for a body that had washed up years ago, someone nobody bothered to identify. He looked me dead in the eye and challenged my manhood. He dared me to walk over to that forgotten grave and relieve myself right on top of it. He said there were rumors that the restless spirit haunted the bank, and he wanted to see if I had the guts to disrespect it. Every alarm bell in my head was deafening. I knew exactly what was out there. I had seen her, but when I hesitated, I saw Me leaning her head against another guy's shoulder, watching me with a raised eyebrow. That was it. That was the trigger. I forced a laugh, stood up on shaky legs, and declared that it was a pathetic dare. I swaggered out of the firelight, stepping into the freezing darkness of the grove. I marched right up to that sunken mound of earth. I undid my pants, and as I went, I actually started talking trash. I practically yelled into the empty woods. mocking the dead. I challenged whatever was out there to show itself, bragging that I wasn't afraid of some imaginary river ghost. I finished, zipped up, and turned back toward the glow of the campfire, feeling an incredibly stupid sense of triumph. I hadn't even taken 3 steps when it happened. My vision simply dissolved. It wasn't like fainting. It was like a thick, static-filled fog rolled violently into my brain. The sounds of my friends laughing became warped and distant, and then absolute blackness. When I opened my eyes, the harsh, unforgiving light of morning was slicing through my bedroom window. I was lying in my own bed. My head was pounding with a vicious hangover, but my mind was completely blank. I had zero memory of how I got home, who carried me, or what happened after I turned away from the grave. I just assumed I had drank way past my limit and blacked out. I lay there for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling, when I noticed a deep, throbbing pressure in my lower abdomen. It felt like my bladder was going to rupture. I threw off the blanket and stumbled out to the back of the house, heading for the bushes to relieve myself. I pulled down my shorts, looked down, and my blood ran absolutely cold. The physical trauma is difficult to describe without sounding grotesque, but I need you to understand the reality of what this entity did to me. My anatomy was deformed. It was swollen to nearly 3 times its normal size, the skin stretched tight and shining with a sickly bruised purple and angry red hue. It looked like it was violently infected, filled with fluid, pulsating with an unnatural heat. The shock of seeing it was bad enough, but the moment I registered the sight, a wave of agonizing, blistering pain shot up my spine. It was a sharp, burning torment. I stood there for maybe 20 minutes, leaning against the rough concrete wall of the house, crying, desperately trying to force out even a single drop of relief. But the swelling had completely sealed everything off. The pressure inside me was building to a critical mass. Defeated and entirely broken, I hobbled back into my room and collapsed onto the bed, curling into a fetal position, clutching myself and groaning in agony. My younger brother heard me. He walked past my room, took one look at me writhing on the bed, and immediately sprinted to the front yard to tattle to our father. He thought I was just dealing with the mother of all hangovers. My dad stormed into the room, furious. He started screaming at me, giving me the lecture of a lifetime about underage drinking and bringing shame to the house. I couldn't even form words to defend myself. I just kept whimpering, the pain overriding any sense of dignity. My dad stopped yelling. He noticed the sweat pouring down my face and the sheer terror in my eyes. He stepped closer, pulled back the blanket, and physically recoiled. He demanded to know what I had done. He was panicking, asking if I had caught some horrific disease or been burned. I could barely choke out that I just needed to go to the bathroom and couldn't. He didn't ask any more questions. He threw me onto the back of his motorbike and drove like a maniac to the nearest clinic. But the local clinic was packed with people from our village, and the sheer humiliation of my condition made me beg him to take me somewhere else. He drove us to the main district hospital. They rushed me into the emergency ward. The doctors immediately inserted a catheter. I cannot describe the profound, humiliating relief of that moment. The doctor looked at my dad with a grim expression and told him that if we had waited even 15 more minutes, my bladder would have ruptured and the internal toxicity would have killed me. But the nightmare wasn't over. Draining the fluid didn't reduce the grotesque swelling, nor did it stop the burning pain. The doctors were completely baffled. They interrogated me about reckless sexual encounters, about chemical burns, about anything that could explain the trauma. I swore to them I hadn't done anything. They admitted me for observation. Back then, you didn't get a private room. I was shoved into a massive echoing ward filled with a dozen other metal beds. The air smelled permanently of bleach and sickness. I was forced to wear this humiliating, oversized hospital gown that felt more like a dress, to accommodate the swelling. My bed was situated in the absolute worst spot, right next to the main double doors of the ward, and directly beneath a large, drafty window. Night fell. The ward grew quiet, save for the sound of breathing machines and the occasional cough. My mother had taken over for my dad, setting out a thin woven mat on the cold floor right next to my bed to sleep and keep watch. Sometime well past midnight, I jolted awake. I didn't need to pee thanks to the medical equipment, but my stomach was cramping violently. I needed to use the actual toilet. The ward didn't have ensuite bathrooms. There was a communal restroom located all the way down the dimly lit hallway. I carefully swung my legs over the edge of the bed, trying not to wake my exhausted mother, and began the slow, painful shuffle out of the room. The hallway was dead silent. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a low, irritating hum. I made it to the men's restroom. It was a sterile, tiled room with a row of individual stalls. The doors to all the stalls were wide open. The room was aggressively bright and completely empty. I went into the middle stall, locked the thin wooden door behind me, and sat down, wincing in pain. I hadn't been there for more than 2 minutes when the lighting fixture directly above me started to fail. It flickered violently, letting out a harsh electrical clicking and buzzing noise as it strobed 3 or 4 times before stabilizing. I tried to ignore it. It was a rundown hospital. Faulty wiring was expected. Then, I heard the sound of a toilet flushing in the stall right next to mine. I froze. I hadn't heard anyone walk into the bathroom. I hadn't heard a stall door close. But again, I forced my brain to find a logical excuse. I convinced myself that someone had just slipped in quietly while the lights were acting up. The overhead light flickered again. This time, it died completely, plunging the entire bathroom into total darkness. The only illumination was the faint, sickly yellow glow spilling in from the hallway under the main door. That was when the crying started. It was coming from the stall next to me. A soft, wet, miserable sobbing. My first thought was genuine sympathy. I assumed it was someone's relative, overwhelmed by the grief of a dying family member, hiding in the bathroom to break down. I sat there in the dark, giving them their privacy. But then, a realization crept up my spine like ice water. The weeping was distinctively female. I was in the men's restroom, in the middle of the night. Why was a woman weeping in the stall next to me? The moment that thought crystallized in my mind, the crying stopped, cut off instantly, as if whoever was in there knew I had figured it out. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, a new sound began, a slow, deliberate scratching noise that sounded unmistakably like jagged fingernails digging directly into the thin partition wall, separating our stalls. And the worst part was I could hear the entity slowly climbing up the wall. Every muscle in my body locked up. I was paralyzed by a fear so profound it felt like I was suffocating. I didn't want to look up. My brain was screaming at me to keep my eyes glued to the tiled floor. But the agonizing, scraping sound reached the top edge of the partition. God help me. I slowly looked up. Hanging over the top of the stall, staring directly down at me, was the woman from the river. Her hair was plastered to her face like wet seaweed. Her skin was a bloated, chalky white. But her eyes, what the fuck? There were no pupils, just 2 milky, dead orbs fixed entirely on me. I didn't even bother pulling up my clothes properly. I burst out of that stall, shoving the door open so hard it slammed into the wall, and I sprinted down the hallway like a madman. I scrambled back into the ward, lunged onto my metal bed, and ripped the thin blanket over my head, violently shaking. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, trapped under the fabric, sweating profusely, my heart hammering against my ribs. The logical part of my brain tried to negotiate with the terror. I told myself it was just a hallucination, a fever dream caused by the pain and the medication. I convinced myself that I was safe in a room full of people. The ward was suffocatingly hot. After about 15 minutes, I couldn't take the lack of air anymore. I slowly, trembling, lowered the blanket from my face. The room was still. Nothing was there. I let out a long, shaky exhale, but then I remembered the large window directly above my head. It was slightly ajar. I decided I needed to shut it, just to feel a barrier between me and the outside world. I carefully pushed myself up onto my knees and reached for the window latch. As my hand grabbed the metal handle, I heard a sickening, heavy flapping sound right outside the glass, sounding exactly like a huge piece of wet canvas, violently snapping and thwopping in a heavy wind, which made me slowly turn my head. She wasn't outside the window. She was floating in the air, right at the foot of my bed, hovering inches off the floor, her waterlogged dress dripping invisible water, her milky eyes boring a hole straight through my soul. I completely lost my mind. I tore my vocal cords screaming about a ghost, thrashing backward against the wall, shrieking at the top of my lungs. The entire ward erupted in chaos. Patients jolted awake. Monitors beeped. Elderly people started yelling, demanding to know what maniac was screaming in the middle of the night. I looked frantically around the room, and when my eyes snapped back to the foot of the bed, the space was empty. She was gone. I looked down at the floor. My mother was completely out cold, snoring softly on her mat. I had woken up 26 strangers, and my own mother hadn't even stirred. Humiliated and utterly terrified, I scrambled off the bed and crawled onto the floor next to her, desperately shaking her awake, begging to sleep beside her. She drowsily told me I was having a nightmare, but when she saw the sheer panic in my eyes, she let me stay. The next morning, she was so unnerved by my state that she practically dragged my father back to the hospital to take her place. The turning point happened later that day. My friends, the ones from the bonfire, came to visit me. They looked incredibly guilty. They confessed that after I had passed out near the grave, they had carried me back to the campfire. They said I had suddenly sat up, but my posture was entirely wrong. I was huddled on myself. And then, I started crying. According to them, I looked at them with an expression that wasn't my own, and sobbed, introducing myself as Tessa. I told them I had died when I was 16, 30 years ago. They realized instantly that I had brought something back with me. They said the entity speaking through my mouth begged them to let me stay at the river. She said she liked me, that she wanted to play with me. My friends had to literally beg and plead with the empty air, negotiating for my life, until whatever was inside me finally released its grip, allowing them to carry my unconscious body home. When my father, who was standing in the hospital corridor, overheard this confession, he completely lost it. He stormed in, grabbed me by the collar of my gown, and cursed my absolute stupidity. He realized immediately that the doctors couldn't fix me because this wasn't a medical issue. It was a spiritual retaliation. He marched straight home, gathered my mother, and they hired a local spiritual practitioner, someone who deals with the things that slip through the cracks of our reality. They dragged me out of the hospital, against medical advice, and brought me back to the riverbank. My entire extended family was there. Over 30 people standing around that sunken grave in the fading afternoon light. The practitioner began the ritual. He burned incense and chanted, attempting to summon the girl's spirit to negotiate terms. Suddenly, my mother, who was standing a few feet away from me, let out a blood-curdling shriek and pointed directly at the empty space beside me. She screamed that she could see the girl in the white dress standing right next to me. Before anyone could react, my mother collapsed onto the wet mud. She writhed for a second, then snapped upright. She didn't look like my mother anymore. Her eyes were wide and frantic. She lunged forward, wrapping her arms around my legs, burying her face into my knees. Then she spoke, but the voice that tore out of her throat wasn't hers. It was the voice of a lonely, desperate teenager. I remember the practitioner asking the entity through my mother why she was torturing me. My mother's face twisted into a grotesque, mocking pout. She said she did it to punish me for desecrating her only home. She explained her tragedy, how she was assaulted, murdered, and thrown into the water decades ago, her body washing up here, unidentified and forgotten. The thing wearing my mother's face whined that she just wanted me to stay down there and play with her, promising that if I came with her, she would make the pain stop and wouldn't hurt me. The practitioner tried to offer her a paper effigy, promising to burn it so she would have a companion in the afterlife, offering to help her transition and reincarnate. The entity just laughed, a chilling, hollow sound that echoed off the river. She mocked the idea of a paper doll. She wanted flesh and blood. She wanted me. Seeing that diplomacy was failing, the practitioner resorted to force. He bound my mother's wrists and ankles with red cord, chanting aggressively, slapping a heavy, ink-stained talisman directly onto her forehead. My mother screamed in absolute agony. She convulsed on the ground, fighting the restraints, until suddenly she turned her head and locked eyes with me one last time. The voice whispered, "Don't forget me." Then, the talisman burst into sudden flame, and my mother went limp. When she woke up, she had no memory of the possession. The practitioner wiped the sweat from his brow and declared that he had banished her, and physically, the curse lifted. Over the next few days in the hospital, the swelling slowly subsided. I regained my bodily functions. I was eventually discharged, bearing only the mental scars of what I had endured. I swore I would never step foot near that riverbank again. Years went by. Life moved on. I grew up, got engaged, and tried to bury the memory of Tessa under the mundane reality of adulthood. But I know she never truly left, because the night before my wedding, I had a dream. It was so incredibly vivid that I could smell the damp earth. I was standing on the edge of the mulberry grove, and standing out in the shallow water of the river was the girl in the white dress. She didn't look angry anymore. She just looked at me, gave me a slow, sad smile, and then leaned backward, sinking completely beneath the black surface of the water without a splash. The practitioner didn't banish her. He just forced her to let go of my wrist. She is still down there, in the dark water, waiting. And sometimes, when the house is completely quiet, I catch myself wondering what would happen if I ever drove past that river again. I think the scariest part about hitting rock bottom is what you're willing to invite into your life just to feel a little less empty. Looking back now, 11 years later, I can sit here and call myself every name in the book. Naive, pathetic, selfish. But back then, at 24, my entire universe was confined to a cramped row of rental rooms on the outskirts of Saigon, a place where the tin roofs baked in the relentless sun and the alleyways were perpetually damp with dishwater and cheap soap. You know the kind of place. The walls are so freaking thin you can hear your neighbor clicking their pen, let alone breathing. Rent was dirt cheap, maybe 20 or 30 bucks a month, which was all I could afford working long hours at a dead-end job. It was a suffocating existence. The air always heavy, smelling faintly of exhaust fumes and rotting fruit from the street market nearby. I lived alone, except for the old woman in the room next to mine. Everyone just called her Suzanne. She was this withered, deeply wrinkled lady originally from the deep west, down by the Mekong where the rivers run muddy and the old superstitions are still treated like gospel. People in the complex gave her a wide berth. There were whispers, the kind of nasty gossip people spread when they don't understand someone. They said she messed with dark stuff, root work, hexes, tying spirits to talismans, whatever you want to call it. The rumor was that if you crossed her, bad luck would just sort of cling to you until you eventually packed up and moved away. But I never saw that side of her. To me, she was just an old woman whose joints ached when it rained. I'd help her carry her heavy groceries up the narrow steps, or buy her some medicine and cook her rice porridge when the flu kept her bedridden. Because of that, she treated me like blood. She was fiercely protective of me. God, I wish I had just listened to her. My whole world back then revolved around my boyfriend. Let's call him Thang. He was older, almost 30, and I was completely, humiliatingly obsessed with him. But there was a catch, and there's always a catch, isn't there? He kept me a secret. For nearly 3 years, we were ghosts to his actual life. He never introduced me to his friends. I never met his family. Whenever I'd press him on it, my throat tight with that pathetic need for validation, he'd feed me the same tired excuses. He wasn't ready. He needed his career to take off first. He wanted to be a proper provider before presenting me to his parents. I swallowed it all. I let him gaslight me into thinking I was the impatient one. I think deep down, I knew he was seeing other girls, stringing me along as a backup option. But I was so terrified of being alone in that sweltering, lonely city that I just shut my eyes to the bullshit. Then came the day the floor fell out from under me. His mother had set him up with someone else. A girl from a good family, someone whose background matched his, someone pretty and docile. They dated for a few months behind my back, and before I even knew she existed, they were engaged. He called me out to a cheap noodle stand one night. I thought it was just a regular date. Instead, he didn't even look me in the eye. He just stared at his untouched bowl and mumbled that he was marrying someone else. that he had to obey his parents, and that we were done. Just like that, 3 years erased in 3 damn minutes. He got up, paid for his food, and walked away. I completely lost my mind. And I don't mean I was just sad. I mean a total, psychotic break from reality. I locked myself in my stifling room and just screamed. I skipped work. I bought cheap, burning liquor from the corner store, stuff that tasted like rubbing alcohol, and drank until I threw up, then drank some more. I howled his name at the walls. The neighbors knocked, complained, asked if I was okay, but I ignored all of them. After a month of this agonizing rot, the pain didn't dull. It metastasized. I couldn't take the weight of my own body anymore. I tried to end it. I really did. If Suzanne hadn't noticed the unnatural silence from my room and forced the landlord to break the padlock, I wouldn't be here. She dragged me back from the edge, rode in the ambulance with me, and brought me home when the hospital finally discharged me. The day we got back to the dingy apartment, I just collapsed on her worn linoleum floor, clutching her frail legs, bawling like a wounded animal. I told her I couldn't breathe without him. I begged her, pleaded with her to just let me see him one more time. The desperation in my chest felt like shattered glass. She looked down at me, her eyes heavy with a profound, weary sadness. Finally, she sighed. A long, ragged sound. She told me she would help me. Just once. She made it painfully clear that what she was about to do was a temporary band-aid, not a cure. It wouldn't last, and I was absolutely not to ask her to do it again. My heart hammered against my ribs. I practically vibrated with a sickening kind of joy. She asked if I had anything of his. I scrambled into my room and tore through my messy closet, finding a faded t-shirt he used to sleep in and a printed photograph of us from a beach trip years ago. I brought them to her like a dog, fetching a prize. She told me to wait until exactly 2 a.m. When the hour hit, the air in the alley was dead. No breeze, no stray cats, just the suffocating humidity and the distant hum of a flickering street lamp. We walked out to a 3-way intersection at the edge of the neighborhood. The asphalt was still radiating the heat of the day. Suzanne pulled a rusted sewing needle from her pocket. Without a word, she grabbed my hand, calloused fingers gripping mine tight, and pricked my index finger. She squeezed a single, dark drop of my blood directly onto Thang's face in the photograph. Then, she wrapped his old shirt around the picture, pulled out a lighter, and set it on fire. The flames chewed through the fabric, casting long, twitching shadows across her wrinkled face. She handed me a scrap of paper with some words scribbled on it and told me to read it aloud. I didn't understand the language. It sounded harsh, rhythmic, like stones grinding together, but I read it, without hesitation. When the ash finally cooled, she told me to go home. The next morning my phone buzzed. It was him. My hands shook so violently I almost dropped it. When I answered, his voice sounded thick, slurry, like he was talking through a heavy fog. He said he missed me. He said he needed to see me right now. An hour later he was at my door. He practically tore it off its hinges. He grabbed me, pulling me into a desperate, bruised embrace, acting like a starving man who had finally found water. We spent 3 days locked in my room. It felt like a fever dream. I was so blissfully ignorant, so drunk on having him back, I ignored the fact that his skin was clammy, or that his eyes looked a little out of focus. On the morning of the 4th day, he sat up in bed, blinked hard, and looked around the room like he had just woken up from a coma. He looked at me, horrified. He demanded to know what the hell he was doing here. Before I could even stutter out a reply, his face hardened. He told me he was getting married, to stay away from him, and stormed out. The withdrawal was worse than the initial breakup. I crawled over to Suzanne's room, sobbing, begging her for another fix. She was furious. She warned me that the magic drew on wandering things from the streets, starving, aimless entities that hung around crossroads. The blood was a bribe to make them drag his mind back to me. It wasn't love. It was hijacking. It wasn't good for him, and it was toxic for me. But I didn't care. I degraded myself. I brought up every bowl of soup I cooked for her, every time I rubbed medicated oil on her aching back. I weaponized my kindness until she finally, reluctantly, caved. We did it again. He came back. 3 days of hollow, frantic affection. Then he woke up, disgusted, and left. And then, a family emergency called Suzanne back to her hometown in the Delta for 2 weeks. The 3 days ran out. The silence in my room became deafening. The hunger for his presence gnawed at my stomach lining. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I decided I didn't need the old woman. I had watched her closely. I knew the steps. I found another pair of his shorts he'd left behind. I took another photo. At 2 a.m., I walked out to that same desolate intersection. The streetlights overhead flickered violently, casting erratic shadows across the cracked pavement. I pulled out a sterilized razor blade, but as I held it over my finger, a twisted logic poisoned my brain. If one drop of blood bought me 3 days, what would happen if I gave more? I wanted him forever. I wanted him to never leave that room. I pressed the blade deep. The cut stung sharply. I let the blood well up, thick and dark, and dripped it over his face in the photo. Not one drop. I squeezed my finger until the picture was slick and heavy with red. I wrapped the clothes around it, set it ablaze, and recited those grinding, rhythmic words from memory. But this time, I added my own plea into the dark street. I whispered to whatever was listening in the heavy night air. I begged it to keep him with me. I promised I would pay whatever price, any price. Looking back, the absolute arrogance of that moment makes me physically sick. You don't offer a blank check to the dark. He showed up the next evening, but the moment I opened the door, a cold dread pooled in my gut. He looked terrible. He was a tall, heavily built guy, but now his clothes hung off him like a scarecrow. His cheekbones protruded sharply. Dark, bruised bags dragged under his eyes, which were completely bloodshot. He didn't speak. He just shuffled into the room, his movements disjointed and stiff, and collapsed onto the bed. He stayed for a whole week. The spell hadn't broken, but this wasn't my boyfriend. He barely talked. The atmosphere in my tiny apartment turned rancid. It constantly felt like the air pressure was dropping before a massive storm. The room started to smell, a damp copper scent mixed with the odor of standing water. Then the night terrors started. I'd wake up at 3 in the morning, shivering despite the stifling heat, to find the front door wide open. Thang would be sitting on the threshold, his back resting against the doorframe, staring out into the pitch-black alley. I'd call his name, but he wouldn't blink. His eyes were wide, glassy, reflecting the weak amber light from the street. One night, as I crept out of bed to guide him back inside, my breath hitched in my throat. Standing just outside the doorway, hovering right beside his shoulder, was a silhouette. It was a man, or at least it had the shape of one, but it was completely featureless, except for a wide, impossibly stretched grin made of glowing, jagged teeth. I blinked, my heart slamming against my ribs, and the shadow was gone. I convinced myself it was just a trick of the light, internal gaslighting at its finest. I pulled Thang inside, and he followed me like a heavy, lifeless doll. Things escalated when his family figured out where he was. His mother and his new fiancée showed up at my complex, furious, banging on my door. I was terrified, but Thang reacted like a cornered animal. He didn't just argue. He sprinted into my tiny kitchenette, grabbed my heavy meat cleaver, and lunged at the door. He screamed in a voice that didn't belong to him. It was raspy, layered, almost echoing in the small space. He threatened to butcher anyone who tried to take him away, promising to bury the blade in their throats. His own mother couldn't even recognize the monster standing in front of her. They fled in terror. I should have called the police. I should have run. But I was trapped in this sunken cost fallacy of my own making. The breaking point happened 2 days later. I had gone to the market and bought groceries, intending to make a proper meal to snap him out of whatever sickness he had. I left a bag of raw beef and unpeeled shrimp on the counter and stepped into the cramped bathroom. Over the running water, I heard a wet, tearing sound. It sounded like thick canvas being ripped apart, followed by a wet crunching. I slowly opened the bathroom door. Holy fucking shit. Thang was crouched on the kitchen floor. He hadn't cooked anything. He was clutching a slab of raw bloody beef in his bare hands, tearing chunks off with his teeth and swallowing them whole. Blood smeared across his chin and dripped onto his shirt. Next to him, he had crushed a handful of raw shrimp, shells, legs, and all, shoving them into his mouth and chewing with a sickening, rhythmic crunch. My stomach heaved. I stumbled backward, asking him what he was doing. He didn't stop chewing. He just turned his head toward me, a piece of raw meat hanging from his lip, and whined in that awful, layered voice. He whined that he was starving, his layered voice echoing as he complained that I had made him so hungry. It wasn't Thang. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The thing looking at me didn't know me. It was just using a familiar face to mock me. By the grace of some higher power, Suzanne returned from the country the very next morning. I ran to her the second I heard her unlock her door. When she stepped into my room and saw Thang curled up in the corner, chewing on his own fingernails, she let out a horrified gasp. She grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin, and dragged me into the hallway. She demanded to know what I did. I confessed everything. The blood, the crossroad, the promise. She looked at me like I was already a corpse. She explained, her voice trembling, that I hadn't cast a love spell. I had sent up a flare in the darkest part of the spiritual world. By bleeding so heavily, by offering a blank check, I hadn't just attracted a passing spirit to nudge Thang's mind. I had invited a starving, malignant street entity to fully possess his body. It was feeding on his life force, and when it was done hollowing him out, it would turn its attention to me. It would drag my soul down to serve it. I was going to kill the man I loved, all because I couldn't let him go. I begged her to fix it. I told her I didn't care if I lost him, just save his life. She warned me that forcing a parasitic entity out after it had rooted itself this deeply would cause permanent damage. Thang would survive, but his mind would never be the same. The trauma of being a passenger in his own body, while a demon drove it, would leave him fractured. I nodded, the tears blinding me. I had to accept it. Suzanne went into her room and came back with a short, heavy blade. It looked ancient, the iron pitted and completely crusted in brown rust. We walked back into my room. Thang was still in the corner. When he saw Suzanne, his head snapped up. His eyes widened, but the pupils were dilated so far they looked completely black. Suzanne sat on a plastic stool across from him. Her voice dropped an octave, commanding and harsh. She told the thing to leave the vessel, to go back to the streets where it belonged. Thang's face contorted into a vile, arrogant sneer. The voice that came out of his mouth made the hair on my arms stand up. It was a wet, guttural hiss. He spat out that he wasn't leaving, claiming he liked this skin and was staying right here with me. He pointed a trembling, blood-stained finger at my face, insisting that I was his wife now and that Suzanne couldn't make him leave. Suzanne didn't argue. She moved with a speed that defied her age. She lunged forward, raising the rusted blade, and slashed it violently across his chest. The blade tore his shirt, but there was no blood, not a single drop. Instead, Thang's back arched so hard I thought his spine would snap. He threw his head back and unleashed a shriek that rattled the cheap window panes. It sounded like a pig being slaughtered. His jaw unhinged, opening impossibly wide. And then, he vomited. It wasn't food. It was a torrential flood of thick black sludge. It poured out of him onto the floor tiles, carrying chunks of what looked like rotting meat and clumps of dark hair. The stench was apocalyptic, a mixture of raw sewage, stagnant pond water, and a rotting carcass left in the sun. He convulsed violently for a few seconds, the black bile coating his chin, and then collapsed, face first, into the mess, completely unconscious. We called an ambulance. They pumped his stomach, diagnosed it as severe food poisoning and dehydration. His family arrived at the hospital, screaming at me, cursing my name, blaming me for his state. I took it all. I deserved worse. Just like Suzanne predicted, Thang was never the same. The doctors called it a psychotic break brought on by stress. He spent months in a psychiatric ward, staring at walls, heavily medicated. He lived, but the vibrant, confident man I knew was gone. I thought that was my punishment. The guilt, the loss. I was horribly wrong. 2 nights after Thang was taken away, I was lying alone in my bed. The apartment was finally quiet, but the silence felt aggressive. My stomach kept churning, bubbling as if I had swallowed something foul. My heart raced uncomfortably. I chalked it up to anxiety and forced my eyes shut. Sometime deep in the night, I woke up. I couldn't move. My arms and legs were pinned to the mattress by an invisible, crushing weight. The air in the room was freezing. I forced my eyes to dart around the dark room. There, clinging upside down to the ceiling directly above my bed, was a shadow. It dropped silently onto my chest. The breath was forced out of my lungs. I tried to scream, but my vocal cords were paralyzed. The entity straddled me, and as my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I saw its face. It was vaguely shaped like Thang, but warped through a funhouse mirror. The head was stretched vertically, narrowing to a sharp, needle-like point at the chin and the crown. Its eyes were massive, taking up half its face, completely white and devoid of pupils. It leaned down, its breath smelling exactly like the black sludge Thang had vomited. It smiled, revealing rows of small, needle-like teeth. "You can't escape," it whispered, the voice echoing inside my skull. "You promised to pay the price." I watched in absolute paralyzing horror as the shadowy mass began to dissolve, slipping under the hem of my nightgown. What followed was a violation I still struggle to put into words. It was cold, phantom hands roaming over my skin. It was an invasive, agonizing pressure that felt both physical and spiritual. It ravaged me. It mocked me. It laughed a high, piercing, animalistic laugh as I laid there, weeping silently, begging for a God I didn't believe in to make it stop. It lasted for hours. When the paralysis finally broke, the room was empty. The morning sun was just starting to bleed through the window. My clothes were torn. My body was covered in deep purple contusions, and I was bleeding. I dragged myself off the bed. My legs couldn't hold my weight. I crawled across the floor, scraping my knees, reached the door, unlatched it, and dragged myself into the hallway. I managed to croak out Suzanne's name before the hallway spun, and I blacked out. I woke up in a clinic. Suzanne was sitting beside the bed, her face grim. She told me she had found me collapsed in the dirt, bruised and bleeding. She looked at me, a profound pity in her eyes. The entity hadn't been banished. When she forced it out of Thang, it didn't return to the streets. Because I had used so much of my own blood, because I had offered myself as payment, the thing had latched onto my spiritual signature. It was claiming me. I sobbed, burying my face in my hands, begging her to save me. I didn't want to die like this. I didn't want to be a vessel for that monster. She agreed, but warned me that the karma I had accrued was massive. She took me to her room, surrounding the bed with talismans to keep me safe while I healed. A few days later, when I could walk, she went to the market and bought a large, cheap vanity mirror with a red plastic frame. She told me to bring one of my unwashed shirts. At exactly 2 a.m., we walked back to that cursed intersection. Suzanne poured a ring of salt and uncooked rice onto the asphalt. She placed the mirror flat on the ground. She took 3 strands of my hair, laid them on the glass, and set them on fire. As the hair curled and burned, releasing a foul smell, she handed me my shirt. She told me to wrap the mirror in it and hold it tightly against my chest. She began to burn a thick stack of ghost money, chanting under her breath. Suddenly, the still night air shattered. A violent, localized gust of wind ripped through the crossroad. It caught the burning paper, creating a miniature cyclone of fiery ash. The tornado of embers spun wildly, hissing like a nest of angry wasps. Suzanne yelled over the wind, pointing at the vortex, She screamed at me to hold it up and open the shirt. I unwrapped the mirror and held the reflective glass toward the swirling ash. It was the most impossible thing I have ever seen. The wind shrieked, and the cyclone of ash was sucked directly into the flat surface of the mirror. It didn't bounce off. It vanished into the glass like water down a drain. The glass instantly turned pitch black, like a puddle of ink. The mirror in my hands suddenly weighed 100 pounds. It burned against my palms like dry ice. I cried out and dropped it. It hit the pavement with a heavy thud, but it didn't shatter. Suzanne dove onto it. She sliced her own thumb with her rusted knife, smearing a bloody symbol across the black glass. She wrapped my shirt tightly around it, binding the entity inside. She was panting, sweating profusely, but she managed a weak nod. We had caught it, but we couldn't just throw it in the trash. We walked for miles until we reached a large bridge spanning one of the deep, muddy canals that fed into the river. Suzanne pulled a heavy burlap sack from her bag. We placed the wrapped mirror inside and then spent an hour scrounging the riverbank in the dark, filling the sack with heavy stones. When it was full, we tied it tight with thick nylon rope. Together, we hoisted the heavy, lumpy sack over the concrete railing. It hit the black water with a heavy splash and sank instantly. Suzanne leaned against the railing, catching her breath. She didn't look relieved. She looked at me and delivered a warning that still keeps me awake at night. She said we trapped it, but karma is a natural law. It cannot be destroyed, only delayed. Someday, the nylon rope will rot, the burlap will tear, the glass will break beneath the shifting mud of the riverbed. She didn't know if it would be in 5 years or 50, but when it escapes, it will come looking for the blood it was promised. It will look for me, and it will look for her. Suzanne moved back to the country shortly after that. She refused to speak to me again, claiming our association was a stain on her soul. I couldn't blame her. She passed away 6 years later. I went to her funeral, standing in the back, silently thanking her for trading her peace for my life. It's been 11 years now. Thang's family still hates me, and I deserve it. I spend my weekends volunteering at temples, giving away my money, trying to scrub the stain off my own karma. I try to be a good person, but every time it rains heavily, every time the rivers swell and the mud shifts beneath the dark water, I can't sleep. I just sit in my room, staring at the ceiling, waiting to hear the sound of wet footsteps outside my door. You know what's worse than a grueling 12-hour family road trip? Finally getting to your rental house at 8 in the evening, absolutely bone-tired, only to realize the landlord is looking at you like you're a walking disease. That was us right before the new year in 2019. We had this massive family gathering, 14 of us in total, and we decided to head up to Dalat, a mountain town that is perpetually choked in a damp, freezing mist that smells like wet pine and old dirt. We weren't coming from the city, though. We all lived down in Longhai, a scorching hot coastal town where the sun just bakes the asphalt all day. So the idea of escaping to the freezing highlands sounded like absolute heaven. Moving 14 people isn't a joke, so we had to split up. A bunch of us piled into a cramped 7-seater SUV, and the rest formed a little convoy of 3 motorbikes trailing right behind us. The whole accommodation thing was handled by my older sister. She figured that getting a bunch of hotel rooms for 14 loud, obnoxious family members was a bad idea. Mostly because hotels get really cranky if you try to bring outside food into the rooms and throw a drinking party on the floor. Her logic was that we should just rent a homestay, specifically one that allowed cooking, so we could hit the local mountain markets, buy a bunch of wild game or whatever local meat they had, and just get hammered in the comfort of our own space. She ended up booking this place on a pretty well-known street. I'm going to leave the exact name and address out of this, mostly because the place has since completely shut down, which honestly makes perfect sense given what we went through. By the time we actually navigated the winding mountain passes and pulled up to the property, it was already pushing 8 in the evening. We had left at the crack of dawn, but traveling with a convoy of bikes and an SUV full of people means you stop every hour for bathroom breaks, food, and stretching. We were absolutely exhausted. And on top of that, we had a toddler with us. My niece. Let's call her Nora. She was barely 2 years old, cranky from the altitude change, and just done with being strapped into a car seat. We parked in front of the place, and I took a good look at it. It was just a standard narrow 4-story building. Ground floor, first, second, and third. You could tell it used to be just a normal family home that some older couple decided to slap a homestay label on to make some retirement money. The owners were this elderly couple, probably in their late 60s, both with heavily salt and pepper hair and a vibe that just immediately put me on edge. When my sister had called to book the place and put down a deposit of a few million dong, roughly $150 or so, they were supposedly super sweet on the phone. But the second we walked in, the old lady looked at us like we were a disease. She immediately started complaining, whining about how late we were, saying that she assumed we were no-shows and was just about to give our spot to another group. My sister, trying to keep the peace, politely reminded her that we had already paid a hefty deposit and that 8 o'clock at night really wasn't that late for travelers. The old woman just scoffed, muttering about how she was old and needed to sleep early, and how young people have no respect for the night. It was just an incredibly weird defensive way to greet paying guests. We brushed it off, handed over the rest of the cash for a 2-night stay, and grabbed our bags. My sister had intentionally booked the entire top floor, the 3rd floor, because the landlords had advertised it as having these beautiful floor-to-ceiling glass walls. The pitch was that you could wake up, pull back the curtains, and watch the morning fog roll over the valley from your bed. Well, we dragged our heavy luggage up 3 flights of narrow, creaky stairs, opened the door, and I just sighed. It was a massive, single, open-concept dorm room, but it was incredibly run down. The glass walls they bragged about were entirely fogged up with years of permanent water stains and actual mold growing in the corners. You couldn't see a single thing out of them even if you wanted to. But whatever. We were tired. We had already paid, and we were determined to salvage the night. We split into groups, unpacked our stuff onto the thin floor mattresses spread out across the room, and a few of us went out to the night market to buy some alcohol and snacks. By about 9 o'clock, the drinking party had officially started. We were all sitting in a circle on the floor near the balcony. Now, to understand how messed up this night got, you need to understand the layout of this massive room, because there were 4 distinct zones where things went incredibly wrong. There was the main sleeping area where all the floor mats were pushed together. There was the wooden staircase leading up to our floor. There was the glass balcony looking out over the dark street. And finally, right next to where we were sitting and drinking, there was an old wooden altar mounted high up on the wall. It was clearly meant to be a Buddhist altar, a huge wooden shelf bolted to the concrete, but it was completely stripped bare. There were no statues, no incense burners, no offering plates. Just a massive, empty wooden plank covered in thick cobwebs and dust. It looked like the owners had cleared it out but were too frail or too lazy to actually pry the heavy wood off the wall. We were a few beers deep. The volume in the room was getting a little loud, and my buddy Caleb, who was already getting pretty flushed from the alcohol, pointed up at the empty altar and started making jokes. He was laughing, telling the guys that if we ran out of floor space tonight, someone could just climb up and sleep on the altar shelf because it was big enough to fit a grown man. A few of the older folks in the group immediately scolded him, telling him it was incredibly bad luck to joke about an altar, but Caleb just kept laughing, pointing out that there was literally nothing holy left up there. No statues, no incense, just an empty piece of wood. We let it go and kept drinking. Around 10 o'clock, we ran out of the easy snacks and realized we still had a massive log of cured pork sausage we had brought from home. The problem was, nobody had brought a knife to slice it. I figured, it's a homestay. The whole point is that we're allowed to prepare food, so I volunteered to go downstairs to the ground floor and ask the grumpy old landlords to borrow a kitchen knife. I walked down the 3 flights of stairs in the semi-darkness, and when I reached the ground floor, I noticed the old lady was still wide awake. This was the same woman who had chewed us out for arriving at 8 because she supposedly went to bed early. And yet here she was, past 10 at night, just puttering around in the dimly lit kitchen. I politely got her attention and asked if I could borrow a small knife to cut some sausage. She immediately tensed up, looking at me with this wild, suspicious glare, and demanded to know why a bunch of people drinking needed a weapon. I tried to laugh it off, explaining we just needed to slice some food, but she wasn't having it. She reluctantly dug into a drawer, pulled out a cheap yellow-handled utility knife, and practically shoved it into my hand. She then went on this intense, hushed rant, telling me to cut the meat and bring the knife back down to her the exact second I was done. She kept muttering about how she was so incredibly exhausted, how she couldn't deal with drunk people getting into violent arguments, and how she absolutely refused to have a murder happen in her house. Her choice of words sent a genuine chill down my spine. The way she said she was so tired of it didn't sound like a landlord, annoyed by noisy guests. It sounded like someone who had personally scrubbed blood off the floorboards before. I just nodded, wanting to get away from her heavy, suffocating energy, and walked back upstairs. When I got back, I told the group I wasn't going back down there to return it tonight, because the old lady was acting completely unhinged, so we just sliced the food and left the knife on a paper plate. Right around this time, little Nora, the toddler, was having a complete meltdown. She was exhausted, but she absolutely refused to sleep in the big room. She kept crying, aggressively pointing at the door, begging her mom to go home. We assumed the room was just too stuffy. Delat is freezing outside, but because none of these old houses have air conditioning to circulate the air, having 14 bodies crammed into one space makes it feel incredibly heavy and hard to breathe. Her mom, Mia, finally gave up, grabbed the keys to the SUV, and announced she was going to take Nora down to the car, turn on the engine for a bit to get the AC flowing, and let the kid fall asleep in the comfortable passenger seat before carrying her back up. Her husband, Mike, just mumbled in agreement and kept drinking. So Mia and the baby went downstairs. We kept drinking. Maybe 20 minutes later, one of the guys, Tom, who was sitting directly facing the stairwell, suddenly stopped mid-sentence. He aggressively rubbed his eyes, frowned, and told me to just go downstairs and return the knife to the old lady because she was making him nervous. I looked at him, confused, and told him the old lady wasn't up here. Tom pointed a shaking finger toward the top of the stairs and insisted that he had been watching someone lurking in the shadows of the stairwell for the past 5 minutes. He said a dark figure kept pacing up and down the top few steps without making a single sound, continuously poking their head around the corner to stare directly at our group, and occasionally pointing a long dark finger at us. We all immediately fell silent and stared at the empty stairwell. There was nothing there. Someone called him an idiot, reminding him that the wooden stairs creaked loudly under anyone's weight, and we hadn't heard a single footstep. A couple of the guys actually got up, annoyed, walked over to the stairwell, and flipped on the bright overhead light. The stairwell was completely empty. There was nowhere to hide. We told Tom he was just hammered and seeing his own shadow, and we forced him to drink some water. By about 11:30, the party naturally died down. Everyone was exhausted, dizzy from the altitude and the alcohol, and we all started claiming our sleeping spots on the floor mats. I found a spot near the middle of the room. Caleb, the guy who made the altar joke, stubbornly laid his mat out right directly underneath that empty wooden shelf. Down in the car, things were taking a much darker turn. Mia later told us that she had successfully gotten Nora to sleep in the car with the AC running, and because she had a few beers herself, she accidentally drifted off in the driver's seat. She woke up just before midnight because little Nora was urgently slapping her cheek. Mia opened her eyes, groggy and confused, to see her toddler standing on the center console, pressing her tiny hands against the windshield, staring straight up at the third-floor balcony of our homestay. Nora kept babbling, pointing her little finger up at the dark glass, asking her mom why Daddy was standing outside in the cold. Mia, still half asleep, looked up at the balcony but couldn't see anything through the fog. She tried to pull Nora down, telling her Daddy was inside sleeping, but Nora's face suddenly contorted in absolute panic. Why did Daddy jump to die? Mia's heart completely stopped. She watched in horror as her toddler hysterically screamed that Daddy had just jumped off the balcony and died on the street. The kid was thrashing, pointing at the empty pavement in front of the car, crying hysterically. Mia didn't even think. Pure, primal adrenaline took over. She grabbed her screaming child, kicked the car door open, and sprinted up 3 flights of stairs so fast her lungs burned. She burst into our room, flipped on the lights, and practically collapsed to her knees when she saw Mike, her husband, snoring loudly on his floor mat, completely safe. She grabbed him, hugging him while Nora sobbed into his chest, and that commotion woke up the entire room. I was sitting up, trying to process why Mia was crying hysterically by the door, when Caleb crawled over to my mat shaking like a leaf, whispering that he couldn't sleep because he kept hearing this dry, rhythmic scraping sound right above his head like old brittle fingernails dragging against the wood. And when he finally sat up and looked at the empty altar, he saw this massive, hunched-over black mass occupying the entire shelf, with two glowing red eyes staring directly down at him. Caleb was so terrified, he just immediately dropped back down onto his mattress, squeezed his eyes shut, and curled up into a ball, not daring to move a single inch until Mia suddenly burst through the door and woke the whole room up, which was the exact moment he finally had the guts to scramble over to my mat. Caleb was completely pale, sweating through his shirt, refusing to even look back toward the altar. Before I could even process the fact that Caleb was terrified, another guy in our group, Ben, sat up from the far corner of the room looking like he was about to vomit. Ben was our lightweight. He had stopped drinking at 10 and went to sleep early. Ben practically choked on his words as he confessed that he had woken up about half an hour ago to use the bathroom, which was out in the hallway. When he came back into the dark room and lay back down on his mat, the very second his head hit the pillow, an unnatural freezing gust of wind hit him so hard it physically paralyzed him. He said he was locked in his own body, unable to move his arms or open his mouth to scream. And as he lay there paralyzed, he watched a tall, pitch-black silhouette of a woman glide into the room from the hallway. He emphasized that she didn't walk, she hovered, her feet never touching the floorboards. Ben, with tears literally pooling in his eyes, described how this faceless shadow woman slowly glided across the room, purposely stepping directly over the bodies of 6 different people sleeping on the floor. He said he watched in absolute horror as every single time the shadow passed over someone, that person would violently flinch or groan in their sleep, like their body was reacting to their soul briefly being smothered. The shadow woman reached the end of the row of beds and just dissolved into the wall. But Ben wasn't taking any chances. The second he felt the unnatural paralysis wear off just enough to move his arms, he instantly yanked his heavy blanket completely over his head. He spent the next 20 minutes trapped under there, shivering so violently his teeth were loudly chattering against each other, just praying to God that whatever that entity was wouldn't come back and peel the covers off him. He was stuck in that suffocating, freezing little cocoon of absolute panic until the exact moment Mia threw the bedroom door open and turned on the lights. It was at that exact moment, sitting in that freezing, stuffy room at 1 a.m, looking at the terrified faces of my family, that the reality of our situation crashed down on me. This wasn't just a house with a ghost. This was an infestation. Tom had seen a lurker on the stairs. Nora had seen a suicide jumper on the balcony. Caleb was being hunted by a demonic entity on the altar. And Ben had watched a shadow woman harvest the energy of half our sleeping family. There was no way in hell any of us were staying in that room. The panic in the air was so thick you could choke on it. But we were 14 people, mostly women and children, and the men were entirely too intoxicated to safely drive the winding mountain roads in the pitch-black fog to find a new hotel. We were trapped. We collectively decided we had to beg the old landlords for a different room on a lower floor, just to get away from the 3rd floor. Mia and Caleb's wife volunteered to go down, figuring the old lady might be more sympathetic to a crying mother. They quietly crept down the stairs to the ground floor. When they came back up a few minutes later, they looked even more disturbed than before. Mia told us that when they got to the ground floor, the entire house was pitch black except for the old couple's bedroom at the back. The door was wide open. Inside, all the lights were off except for 2 tiny, piercing red bulbs illuminating a massive Buddhist shrine. And sitting cross-legged in the center of the dark room, facing the red light, was the old woman. Her hair was completely let down, draped over her shoulders, and she was aggressively chanting sutras under her breath. Mia said the red light catching the woman's face made her look absolutely demonic. When the old lady heard their footsteps, she stopped chanting, slowly stood up, and glared at them. Mia practically begged her, explaining that the kids were terrified and asking if they could please just squeeze into an empty room on the second floor until morning. The old woman didn't ask questions. She didn't ask what scared them. She just reached into her pocket, threw a heavy ring of keys at Mia's feet, and coldly stated that they needed to be out of the building by 6 in the morning. We didn't hesitate. All 14 of us grabbed our pillows, abandoned our heavy luggage, and fled down to the second floor. We unlocked a tiny, cramped spare bedroom and piled in. 14 people sitting shoulder to shoulder on the bare floor, knees tucked to our chests, absolutely silent, waiting for the sun to come up. Nobody slept a single second. Every creak of the floorboards above us made someone flinch. At exactly 6 in the morning, the second the sun came up, we grabbed our bags and basically sprinted down to the ground floor. The old couple was already there. Actually, I don't think the old lady ever went to sleep at all. They were just sitting on their wooden chairs in the dim light, sipping tea. As we hauled 14 people's worth of luggage out to the cars, they didn't say a single word. They just sat there, glaring at us with this incredibly heavy, dark, and suffocating energy. We had been there for less than 12 hours and were leaving $1.5 million dong on the table, roughly $60. But looking at the sheer unspoken malice on that old woman's face, not a single one of us had the balls to ask for a refund. We just threw our bags in the trunk, got the hell out of there, and booked a normal hotel right in the center of town. We didn't experience anything else for the rest of the trip. But when we finally sat down and pieced the night together, the most terrifying realization hit us. We weren't just dealing with a single haunting. That homestay was a literal forest of ghosts. 4 different people in our group were targeted by completely different entities. Just a month ago, I actually had the chance to visit Dalat again. Out of pure curiosity, I decided to drive past that exact street. That 3-story building with the fogged-up glass walls is still standing there, but the homestay is permanently shut down. As for the old couple, I have absolutely no idea where they went, or if they just became a permanent part of whatever the hell was living inside those walls. I don't know how your middle school handled field trips, but the private school I went to had this weird, stubborn obsession with dragging hundreds of us up to the highlands of Dalat every single year. I always suspected the principal just really liked the place, or maybe he was getting some kind of cheap kickback from the tour companies, because there was no other reason to constantly force a bunch of rowdy teenagers onto cramped buses. But back in 2012, I wasn't thinking about logistics. I was just dreading the whole miserable experience. The story takes place during my 9th grade year. Up until the end of 8th grade, I was actually in the top-tier classes, but then I discovered online gaming, started skipping summer school to hang out at dingy internet cafes, and my grades just completely tanked. Because my school was a private institution, they filtered us ruthlessly based on performance, which meant I got dropped straight from the elite class down to the absolute bottom of the barrel. It was a class filled entirely with guys, the kind of delinquents and troublemakers who spent more time in the principal's office than in actual lectures. But honestly, despite the terrible environment, it was probably the most fun I had ever had. Just a bunch of loud, obnoxious teenagers feeding off each other's chaotic energy. Every year, our school organized a mandatory trip to Dalat, a misty mountain town way up in the highlands where the air is incredibly thin and the cold just bites right through to your bones. A stark contrast to the suffocating, exhaust-choked heat of Saigon where we lived. Usually these trips were pretty standard, leaving early in the morning and arriving by noon. But this time, the administration decided to completely change the schedule to save a few bucks on travel costs. They had us gather at the school courtyard at 9 in the night, with the buses rolling out close to midnight, meaning we were going to be driving up steep, treacherous mountain roads in the dead of pitch-black darkness. When my class finally piled onto our assigned bus, the very first thing that struck me was the driver. He was this stern, bald man wearing a faded gray linen outfit that made him look exactly like a temple monk, and he had these heavy wooden prayer beads wrapped tightly around his wrist. His dashboard was an absolute chaotic shrine of spirituality, cluttered with miniature porcelain statues of deities, a tiny brass incense burner, and protective talismans hanging from the rear-view mirror swinging back and forth with every slight movement of the vehicle. The entire front of the bus smelled intensely of stale sandalwood mixed with the sharp, acidic sting of diesel exhaust, creating this heavy, almost hypnotic atmosphere that made my stomach churn slightly. I remember my buddy Leo, who was notorious for being both a massive troublemaker and incredibly superstitious, nudging my ribs and whispering a joke about how we were being driven by a holy man to purge our sins. For the first few hours, everything was just normal, annoying teenage noise. The bus was rattling along the highway. Guys were shouting across the aisles, throwing snacks, and bragging about whatever garbage teenagers brag about. But as we started our ascent into Choi Pass, the atmosphere inside the bus began to shift. If you have never been on a mountain pass in a developing country at 2 in the morning, you need to understand the sheer, oppressive isolation of it. There were absolutely no streetlights, just a narrow, winding ribbon of cracked asphalt bordered by a sheer rock wall on one side and a plunging, invisible abyss of dense jungle on the other. The darkness out there wasn't just an absence of light. It felt thick and suffocating, like a physical weight pressing against the cold glass of the windows. Because the bumpy, winding roads made it impossible to sleep, a few guys in the back started trying to scare each other with local urban legends, arguing loudly about which mountain pass had the most aggressive spirits and bringing up stories about dead hitchhikers and roadside shrines. The driver, who clearly took his spiritual beliefs very seriously, kept glaring at them through the rear-view mirror, his jaw clenched tight in obvious frustration. Eventually, he just snapped, keeping one hand tight on the steering wheel while using the other to frantically gesture at them, practically begging them to shut up and stop inviting bad luck into the vehicle while we were navigating such a dangerous stretch of road. He was genuinely angry, his voice shaking a little bit as he muttered protective chants under his breath, which only made the guys snicker and roll their eyes, writing him off as a crazy old man. And then, maybe 5 minutes after he yelled at them, the bus violently lurched to the right with a deafening metallic bang that vibrated up through the soles of my shoes and rattled my teeth. It wasn't just a slow leak. The front tire had completely blown out with the force of a small explosive, sending a sickening jolt of panic through the cabin as the driver desperately wrestled the heavy vehicle toward the narrow gravel shoulder. He was absolutely livid, cursing under his breath and throwing a furious "I told you so" glare at the back of the bus before grabbing a flashlight and stomping out into the freezing night air to inspect the damage. The sudden breakdown forced a few other buses in our convoy to pull over as well, and the teachers begrudgingly allowed us to step out onto the side of the road to stretch our legs while the spare tire was being hauled out. The air outside was incredibly crisp and smelled heavily of damp earth and thick jungle foliage, but it was also uncomfortably quiet, with the only sound being the low, rhythmic rumbling of the idling engines and the occasional harsh metallic clank of a wrench hitting the asphalt. Leo, complaining that his bladder was about to burst, wandered off past the glow of the headlights, shuffling toward the thick tree line to relieve himself. I honestly didn't pay much attention, just shivering in my thin jacket and waiting for the ordeal to be over, until I realized the teachers were doing a head count to get us back on board, and Leo was still missing. A few of us groaned and walked toward the edge of the woods, calling his name out into the suffocating darkness, expecting him to just be messing around and trying to waste time. When he finally stumbled out from behind a thick cluster of wild banana trees, his face was completely drained of color, pale and slick with a cold sweat that clearly wasn't from the mountain chill. He looked utterly disoriented, grabbing my arm with trembling fingers and frantically pointing back into the pitch-black tree line, stammering about some guy who was just standing there. I told him he was being an idiot and that there was absolutely nobody out there, but he aggressively dragged me toward the bus, his breath hitching in his throat as he refused to look back over his shoulder. It wasn't until we were safely moving again, the new tire humming against the asphalt, that Leo finally calmed down enough to explain what had caused him to practically lose his mind out there in the cold. He whispered to me that while he was standing near the trees, he heard the distinct, heavy crunching of dead leaves and gravel right behind him, assuming it was just one of our classmates coming to use the makeshift bathroom. He told me he even spoke to the guy, making some stupid joke, but when he casually glanced over his shoulder, he saw a figure standing about 15 feet away, dressed in a plain white shirt and dark pants, just staring silently into the dense brush. Leo said the weirdest part was that the guy didn't respond at all, like he just stood there completely rigid. So Leo finished up and turned around to head back to the bus. But as he started walking, he noticed out of the corner of his eye that the figure was moving alongside him. And the messed up thing is, the guy wasn't turning around to walk normally. He was slowly sliding backward, matching Leo's pace step for step, but still facing the pitch-black woods. My chest tightened as Leo described how he stopped dead in his tracks and fully turned around to look at him. The exact second Leo stopped, the figure stopped too. It just froze there for a second. Then instead of sliding backward anymore, the guy started walking forward again, retreating deeper into the thick brush. Leo just stood there, like totally freaked out, watching the guy fade back into the dark. He watched it take maybe 3 or 4 steps into the trees, until it suddenly stopped and violently snapped its head around a full 180 degrees to face him. Leo was gripping the fabric of his jeans so hard his knuckles were white as he swore to me, with absolute, terrifying conviction, that the face staring back at him from over that unnaturally twisted neck was his own face. He said it was like looking into a dead, emotionless mirror, the eyes entirely vacant and the features sagging slightly, lacking any trace of the human spark that makes a person look alive. I desperately tried to rationalize it, internally gaslighting myself and him by insisting that the dark plays tricks on the eyes, that the stress of the blown tire and the stupid ghost stories had just triggered a minor panic attack. I spent the rest of that agonizingly long drive aggressively shutting down the conversation, refusing to entertain the thought, silently praying for the sun to come up and wash away the heavy, awful feeling settling in my gut. By the time we finally rolled into daylight the next morning, the bright sunlight and the bustling energy of the town made the night's events feel like a distant, feverish nightmare, easily brushed under the rug of teenage distraction. Because our class was categorized as the bottom tier, we didn't get the nice, centrally located accommodations near the busy night market like the honor students did. Instead, our bus was routed out toward the quiet, foggy outskirts of the town, pulling up to an older, somewhat run-down hotel that looked like it hadn't been updated since the late 90s. It was a functional building, but it had that distinct, stale odor of damp carpeting and industrial cleaning supplies, and the fluorescent lights in the hallways had a sickly, flickering yellow tint that made the paint on the walls look a bit like bruised skin. We were strictly informed by our chaperone that because our class was almost entirely male, the 3 girls in our group had been relocated to the nicer hotel downtown to avoid any inappropriate mingling, meaning this entire isolated building was occupied strictly by our chaotic group of guys. We spent the entire afternoon exploring the town, exhausting ourselves walking around the lakes and the pine forests, returning to the hotel just after the sun dipped behind the mountains and the temperature absolutely plummeted. Around 8 that evening, we were all piling into the lobby, loud and obnoxious, waiting for a couple of cheap taxis to take us to the night market to grab some grilled food and soy milk. Leo, always the absolute slowest person on earth, was the last one to come downstairs, but when he finally jogged through the glass doors, he had this goofy, excited grin plastered across his face. He nudged my shoulder and started bragging about a girl he had just seen on the 3rd floor, claiming she was standing near the corner room wearing a gorgeous, old-school vintage dress and a wide-brimmed cloth hat. When I asked him who it was, he admitted he had no idea which of the 3 girls from our class it was. He said the hallway was too dim, and she had her back to him, so he couldn't see her face. Then, being the absolute horny teenager he was, he whispered that he didn't really care because he was too busy staring at her ass and checking out her curves. He was completely convinced one of our female classmates had secretly stayed behind and dressed up, totally ignoring how illogical the whole thing was. I just rolled my eyes and told him he was full of crap, reminding him of what the teacher had specifically said about the girls being across town, but he brushed me off, insisting he knew what he saw and that he was going to find her at the market. Of course, when we met up with the rest of the school, an hour later, the girls in our class were completely bundled up in thick wool sweaters and puffy jackets, looking at Leo like he was a total creep when he asked them about the vintage dress. When we got back to the hotel much later that night, Leo actually marched up to the tired-looking woman at the reception desk and asked her who was staying in room 308, the specific corner room on the 3rd floor. I watched the receptionist look at him with a mixture of confusion and profound irritation, flatly stating that our school had booked the entire building and no girls were assigned to that floor, meaning room 308 was either occupied by our loudmouth buddies or completely empty. A cold prickle of unease washed over my arms, but I forced a laugh, punching Leo in the arm and loudly declaring that his desperate hormones were making him hallucinate women in empty hallways, desperately trying to keep the creeping dread at bay. Our room was on the 3rd floor, a cramped space with 2 small beds pushed against faded floral wallpaper, and because we were absolutely dead on our feet, we crashed almost immediately. I am an incredibly heavy sleeper, but I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night, shivering uncontrollably because the temperature in the room felt like it had dropped below freezing. The silence was absolutely suffocating until I heard this slow, deliberate rustling of bed sheets, followed by the heavy, dull thud of bare feet hitting the cheap laminate flooring, sounding unnaturally loud in the dead quiet of the room. I cracked my eyes open and saw Leo sitting bolt upright on the edge of his bed, his shoulders slumped forward in a deeply unnatural, almost marionette-like posture, his arms hanging completely limp at his sides. I mumbled his name, asking him what the hell he was doing, assuming he was just getting up to use the bathroom, but he completely ignored me. His head tilted slightly as if he was intently listening to a conversation I couldn't hear, and he just kept muttering, "Who is calling me? Who is calling me?" under his breath. Then, without another word, he stood up and began walking, not toward the bathroom, but straight toward the heavy wooden door leading out to the main hallway. He didn't hesitate, reaching out with a slow, mechanical precision, turning the brass knob and stepping out into the sickly yellow light of the corridor. My heart started hammering against my ribs, a sudden primal wave of anxiety washing over me, because the way he was moving was completely devoid of life, like a heavy meat suit being clumsily operated from the outside. I dragged myself out of the warm blankets, my bare feet stinging against the icy floor, and scrambled out into the hallway just in time to see him turning the corner toward the main stairwell. I jogged after him, keeping my distance because I remembered hearing some stupid myth about how waking a sleepwalker could cause them to have a heart attack, but my breathing was getting shallow and ragged as I watched him bypass our floor and begin ascending the concrete steps. He walked past the 4th floor, then the 5th floor, his pace slow and terrifyingly deliberate, his bare heels slapping against the cold concrete, echoing aggressively off the narrow walls. The hotel only officially had 5 floors, but the staircase continued upward, leading to a heavy steel fire door that had been propped open with a broken brick, revealing a gaping maw of absolute darkness. When Leo stepped through that doorway, the air instantly changed, smelling sharply of wet cement, exposed rusted rebar, and years of accumulated, undisturbed dust. I crept through the door after him and realized we were on a massive, unfinished 6th floor, a concrete skeleton with no interior walls, no windows, and completely exposed to the freezing night wind blowing off the mountains. There was no electricity up here, just the faint, ghostly glow of the moonlight bleeding through the empty window frames, casting long, jagged shadows across the debris-littered floor. Leo was walking steadily toward the far edge of the building, toward a wide-open gap where an exterior wall should have been, because this floor was completely unfinished and had no outer walls at all, leading straight out into a sheer 6-story drop to the concrete parking lot below. My stomach violently tied itself into a knot, a sudden burst of pure adrenaline flooding my veins as I realized he wasn't slowing down, his feet kicking up small clouds of dust as he marched closer and closer to the deadly edge. I completely abandoned the stupid rule about waking sleepwalkers and sprinted across the rough concrete, tackling him around the shoulders just as his toes breached the precipice. We both crashed hard onto the dusty floor, the impact knocking the wind out of me. But the moment Leo's skin hit the cold cement, his eyes snapped wide open, dilating in absolute terror. She wanted me to follow her down, he screamed, his voice cracking violently into a hysterical sob as he frantically scrambled backward, clawing at the unfinished floor to get away from the drop. He was hyperventilating, stammering out how in his dream the girl had asked him to go to the night market, telling him their taxi had arrived. But instead of leading him down to the lobby, she led him up the stairs to the roof. He was crying uncontrollably as he told me she pointed out into the empty, pitch-black air, said, "The car is here," and just naturally stepped off the edge. He was completely unable to process how he had gotten from his warm bed to the freezing edge of an unfinished construction zone. I didn't ask questions. I just grabbed him by the back of his shirt, hauled him to his feet, and dragged him practically kicking and screaming down the stairs, locking the door to our room and pushing a heavy wooden chair under the handle. We spent the rest of the night huddled on the same bed, completely terrified, jumping at every slight creak of the floorboards, until the morning sun finally broke through the fog and brought a sliver of sanity back to the world. When we aggressively demanded to be moved to a different hotel the next morning, our chaperone didn't argue or brush us off, taking one look at Leo's deeply traumatized face and immediately packing our bags. It wasn't until we were safely on the bus heading back home to the stifling heat of Saigon that the teacher quietly pulled us aside and told us the actual history of that miserable building. He had asked around town, speaking to some local guides, and discovered that the hotel originally only had 5 floors, terminating in a large open-air rooftop terrace. Sometime in the late 90s, a young woman matching Leo's exact description, vintage dress, polka dots, carrying a small canvas suitcase, had checked into the corner room on the 3rd floor, walked up to that rooftop, and deliberately stepped off the edge without a single word to anyone. The incident brought a massive wave of bad luck and terrible rumors to the business, and to hide the notorious suicide spot, the owners simply constructed a concrete shell over the terrace, framing out a fake 6th floor so the building's silhouette would change, and tourists wouldn't recognize it from the gruesome stories. They tried to bury the trauma under tons of concrete and rebar, creating an empty, hollow space that served absolutely no purpose other than to trap whatever miserable energy was left behind. I went back to Day a lot with my family in 2020, completely unrelated to any school function, just taking a cheap motorcycle up to enjoy the cold air. Out of morbid curiosity, I rode past the street where that cheap hotel used to sit, expecting to see it renovated or, turned into a trendy coffee shop or something. Instead, the building had been completely gutted. The exterior walls were smashed out, leaving only the bare concrete support columns and the raw slabs of the floors, just standing there looking like this massive, hollow concrete shell. They had abandoned the property entirely, stripping it down to its bones, and I couldn't help but stare at that top level, the fake 6th floor, and I just felt this intense chill shoot straight down my spine. Honestly, the scariest part about all of this isn't even the ghost stuff. The real horror is knowing that something out there in the freezing woods could perfectly mimic my friend's face, and that a hotel could hide a literal death trap in plain sight. It still messes with me, you know? It leaves me constantly wondering, if I had been just a few seconds slower that night, whose face would have been looking back at me from the bottom of that concrete drop? I honestly don't even know why I'm bringing this up tonight. Maybe it's just the rain hitting the window pane, or maybe it's the fact that I drove past my old high school today and saw the exact spot where everything kind of fractured. You know how it is when you're trying to sleep and your brain just decides to pull up a file from a decade ago and forces you to relive it. Yeah, that's where I'm at right now. This whole thing revolves around my best friend from high school. I'm going to call her Mia. Mia was one of those girls who didn't even have to try. She was just effortlessly pretty, top of the social ladder, without stepping on anyone to get there. and we somehow ended up sharing a desk in 10th grade. We clicked instantly, bonding over shared misery of math homework and terrible cafeteria food, and we basically became inseparable. But in our class there was this guy, let's call him Leo. Leo was the textbook definition of a rich kid with too much time and zero parental supervision. He never studied, practically lived in designer clothes, and he had this unbearable arrogance about him. And unfortunately for everyone, Leo decided that he was absolutely in love with Mia. It wasn't cute. It wasn't some romantic teen movie trope. It was suffocating. For the entirety of 10th grade, this guy just shadowed her every move. He would constantly declare his feelings, and whenever she rejected him, which was always, he would just brush it off like she was playing hard to get. What made it worse was his fragile ego. If any other guy even looked at Mia, Leo would literally gather his sketchy buddies and jump the poor kid after school. It got to the point where everyone in the district knew that Mia was off limits unless you wanted a trip to the emergency room. Before I get into the really messed up part, I need to paint a picture of where we were spending our days. Our school was split into 2 campuses. 10th graders stayed in the old, crumbling building, but once you hit 11th grade, you moved to the brand new annex right next door. Here's the thing about that new annex. It wasn't just built on an empty lot. The city had paved over an old, unmaintained graveyard to build it. And right behind the campus was this dark, sluggish canal. Whenever the monsoon season hit, that canal would flood, and the water would creep right up to the back gates, bringing this awful, stagnant smell with it. People had drowned in that canal over the years. Lots of people. Even the teachers hated the new building. They'd whisper in the faculty room about staying late to grade papers and seeing these weird, distorted shadows drifting past the frosted glass of the doors. Students who used the bathrooms on the ground floor would complain about hearing the sinks turn on full blast, water rushing down the drains, but when they pushed the stalls open, the room would be completely empty. Sometimes you'd just be walking down a silent hallway and you'd hear a slow, deliberate knock from inside a locked supply closet. But we were teenagers. We laughed it off. We thought it was just senior prank stuff or the building settling. So, 11th grade rolls around, and we get moved to the haunted annex. Leo is still in our class, and his obsession with Mia hasn't dialed down at all. It all boiled over on Mia's birthday. We were in the middle of homeroom when Leo strutted in with this massive, gaudy bouquet of flowers. The whole class started acting like a bunch of animals, hooting and clapping, chanting for Mia to just give up and date him. It was humiliating. Mia had finally reached her breaking point. She didn't just reject him. She looked at him with pure disgust, grabbed the flowers, and shoved them right back into his chest so hard they crumpled. She told him, in front of everyone, that she would rather see him dead than ever go out with him. She told him that maybe when he was in the ground, she'd consider it. It was harsh, yeah, but she was cornered. Leo just stood there, his face completely flushed. He didn't yell. He just raised his voice enough for the room to hear and told her that he'd do it, that he'd die just to make her happy, and when he did, he expected her to keep her promise and follow him. We all just nervously laughed it off. It sounded like the pathetic, dramatic whining of a rejected teenager. That night, Mia had the first dream. She told me later that she was standing on the second-floor balcony of her house, looking down at the street, and standing under the flickering streetlight was Leo. Only, his clothes were torn to shreds, and his limbs were bent at these completely unnatural, stomach-turning angles. He was drenched in blood, just staring up at her with this wide, unblinking smile. She jolted awake, drenched in cold sweat, the sun already coming up. When we got to school that morning, the atmosphere was completely suffocating. Everyone was just staring at Mia as she walked down the hall. I ran up to her, practically out of breath, and frantically asked if she had heard the news. She looked exhausted and asked what I was talking about. I had to be the one to tell her that Leo was dead. Her face just drained of all color. She physically stumbled back against the lockers. The story was that around 9 o'clock the previous night, Leo had taken his dad's heavy-duty motorcycle out for a joyride with his friends. He was only 17, nowhere near experienced enough to handle a bike that size. He was speeding, trying to show off, and a massive transport truck clipped him head-on. The impact was so violent, he died before the paramedics even got him into the ambulance. The cops ruled it a tragic, reckless accident. Because he had made such a public spectacle the day before, begging Mia to date him and screaming about dying for her, the entire school was treating Mia like she was the Grim Reaper. It was entirely unfair. But kids are cruel. Later that afternoon, our homeroom teacher announced that anyone who didn't have tutoring could come with her to Leo's house to pay their respects to the family. The silence in the room was deafening. Every single pair of eyes slowly turned to look at Mia. I asked her if she wanted to skip it, but the guilt was eating her alive. She felt responsible. She told me she had to go, or she wouldn't be able to live with herself. We arrived at his house around noon. The heat was absolute garbage, just thick and heavy, and the smell of burning incense was so strong it was making my eyes water. The living room was packed with people mourning. I looked over at Mia, and she looked like a walking corpse. She was pale, shaking, and sweating profusely. I told her to just sit outside, that she didn't have to go up to the altar, but she stubbornly refused. We walked up together. Dozens of kids had already lit incense and placed it in the bronze bowl without incident. But the second Mia stepped up, her hands trembling, and pushed her sticks into the ash, the heavy wooden table holding his portrait violently lurched. It didn't just wobble, it shuddered as if someone was crouching underneath it, violently shaking the legs. The framed photo of Leo tipped over and slammed face down onto the wood with a sharp, sickening crack. Mia screamed, stumbling backward and collapsing onto the floor, completely unresponsive. The room erupted into total chaos. Adults were rushing over, grabbing rubbing alcohol and trying to fan her. I was standing there, my heart hammering in my throat, trying to rationalize it. I told the parents that she was just exhausted, that the heat got to her, and that she was emotionally overwhelmed because she and Leo were close. It was a complete lie, but I couldn't exactly tell a grieving mother that my best friend had told her son to drop dead 24 hours ago. When Mia finally came to, she was disoriented and crying, claiming that her chest suddenly felt crushed and she couldn't breathe. We all agreed to just blame it on a panic attack and left shortly after. But that was just the beginning of the nightmare. Over the next few weeks, the funeral passed, but Mia was withering away. She told me she couldn't sleep because Leo wouldn't stop visiting her. I kept telling her it was just PTSD, just her brain processing the guilt. I was trying so hard to gaslight both of us into believing it was just a psychological response. Then she told me about the bicycle dream. She said she was sitting at her dining table when she heard Leo calling her name from the front gate. In the dream, she felt completely numb, almost hypnotized. She walked outside, and Leo was just standing there with his old bicycle, wearing a plain t-shirt and jeans, looking totally normal. He told her to get on, that they were going for a ride. Even though she despised him in real life, Dream Mia just silently climbed onto the back pegs. They rode through these dark, empty streets until they came across a massive crowd of people gathered under a flickering street lamp. Mia asked him why everyone was crowding around, and Leo calmly replied over his shoulder that there had been a fatal accident. Mia, feeling a pang of sympathy, suggested they go see if they could help. Leo stopped pedaling. He told her there was no point, because the guy was already dead. Mia expressed her pity, and that's when Leo slowly turned his head to look at her. She said his face was completely obliterated. It looked like someone had pressed his skull against the asphalt and dragged him for a mile. The skin on the right side of his face was peeled back, exposing raw muscle and bone, his eye completely scraped away. He looked at her with his remaining eye and told her that the dead guy was him, and he asked if she felt sorry for him now, reminding her to keep her promise. She woke up screaming, her body completely freezing cold, but she was sweating so much her sheets were soaked. She was losing her mind. She was paranoid, jumping at shadows, terrified of crowded streets. She stopped eating. Her parents thought she was just stressed from studying, and she didn't dare tell them the truth. And then came the day the dam finally broke. It was a Tuesday, I think. Mia was walking to school alone. She said the sky was unnaturally dark, heavy with these bruised purple clouds blocking out the sun. The streets were completely abandoned. No cars, no vendors, nothing. She checked her watch, and it was the correct time, but the silence was deafening. She walked into the haunted annex, her footsteps echoing way too loudly down the hallway. She pushed the door to our classroom open and stopped dead in her tracks. The classroom was full, but not with students. Dozens of people were sitting at our desks. Some were old, some were young, some were wearing tattered hospital gowns, others wearing clothes that looked decades out of style. She stood there in the doorway, her brain frantically trying to make sense of it, wondering if it was some weird parent-teacher meeting, but the math wasn't mathing. Then she heard heavy, dragging footsteps coming from the corridor behind her. She slowly turned around. It was Leo. He was standing right there, his body mangled and broken just like in her dreams. In his twisted hands, he was holding a vase. It was a funeral vase, stuffed with yellow chrysanthemums, the kind you put on a grave. But behind Leo, crowding the hallway, was a sea of horrific figures. Entities with skin as white as chalk. Figures drenched in dark, slick crimson. People missing jaws and arms. Leo stepped forward, his broken face pulling into a grotesque smile, and held out the rotting, foul-smelling flowers. "Be mine, Mia." Mia collapsed to her knees. And as she did, the people sitting at the desks inside the classroom stood up. The entities in the hallway pushed closer. They surrounded her, trapping her in the doorway. They all started laughing. It wasn't human laughter. It was this wet, gurgling sound overlapping with high-pitched weeping. They started mocking her, their voices echoing in her skull, telling her that they had granted her wish. They bragged about how they had pulled him under the truck, how they had helped him die just so she would date him, reminding her that she owed him now. The smell of the dead flowers was rotting her lungs. The voices were tearing her brain apart, and she just snapped. She let out this blood-curdling primal scream. Suddenly, she was in her own bed. It was pitch black outside. Her bedroom door burst open, and her parents rushed in, turning on the lights, frantically shaking her. She had been screaming in her sleep so loudly she woke up the entire house. She clung to her mother, violently sobbing, completely unable to form a coherent sentence for almost an hour. The next morning, she didn't show up to school. I went to her house that afternoon and her parents told me they had taken her to the psychiatric ward. The doctors diagnosed her with severe trauma-induced psychosis, claiming the stress of her classmate's death had caused a psychotic break. They gave her heavy sedatives and sent her home, but I knew better. I couldn't explain it, but the terror in her eyes wasn't a medical condition. It was a deep fucking primal fear that medicine couldn't touch. My mom, who always had a foot in the neighborhood gossip circle, heard the story and immediately panicked. She dragged an elder neighbor over to Mia's house, and they basically staged an intervention. They told Mia's parents that science wasn't going to fix a spiritual debt, and that if they didn't consult a medium immediately, their daughter was going to die. Desperate, Mia's parents agreed. They found a local medium, and what she revealed made my blood run cold. The medium explained that the new school campus was an absolute hotbed for restless, hungry spirits. When Mia screamed that curse at Leo in the classroom, those entities heard her. They feed on malice and anger. They thought it would be a hilarious game to actually fulfill the curse. They were the ones who blinded Leo on the road, dragging him under that truck. And now, Leo's confused. Angry spirit was being manipulated by them, demanding that Mia pay the price she promised. The only way to stop it was a direct negotiation. We somehow convinced Leo's grieving parents to come. We all gathered at the medium's house. The medium had brought in another woman, a vessel, to channel Leo's spirit. The room was heavy. You could barely breathe. The vessel started violently shaking, and when she finally spoke, the voice was this deep, raspy, guttural sound that didn't belong to a living person. The spirit looked around and sneered, asking if we were throwing a wedding party for him and Mia. The medium slammed her hand on the table and demanded he leave the girl alone, telling him to accept his death and move on. The vessel slammed her fists down, screaming that Mia had promised to be his if he died, and now that he was dead, he was going to take her with him. The vessel tried to lunge out of the chair, but it was like invisible hands slammed her back down. Leo's parents broke down. They fell to their knees, begging the empty air, pleading with their dead son to spare this innocent girl, apologizing for his pain, offering anything just to stop the madness. We were all crying, begging him to let it go. He fought it. He screamed that it wasn't fair, that the entities had covered his eyes on the highway, that he didn't want to die. But eventually, the combined grief of his parents and the medium's pressure forced him to a halt. He agreed not to drag Mia to the grave, but he left a condition. He stated, with absolute, icy certainty, that Mia could never belong to anyone else. If she ever dated, if she ever married, he would come back and take her life immediately. To save her life in that moment, her parents frantically agreed to the terms. The vessel collapsed, the seance ended, and the medium handed out protective talismans, looking utterly exhausted. It's been years since that day. The nightmares stopped. Leo never appeared in her room again. But sometimes I wonder if surviving was actually a victory. Mia is a ghost. She never dated. She never goes out. She goes to her office job, comes back to her empty apartment, and locks the door. I try to drag her out for coffee maybe once or twice a year, and she just sits there, looking nervously at the shadows, flinching if a motorcycle revs too loudly on the street. She kept her life, yeah, but he kept her future. And the terrifying part is, I know for an absolute fact that he's still waiting in the dark, just watching to see if she'll ever break the rules. Have you ever noticed how the most unassuming things can hold the darkest memories? A creaky floorboard, a stained rug, or an old fruit tree in the backyard. Most people look at a tree and see shade or fruit, but in my old neighborhood, the one I grew up in, there was a starfruit tree that nobody dared to walk under, not after what it saw. This story was passed down to me by my grandmother decades ago. In her tight-knit neighborhood, there were two families who lived side by side. The houses were so close they practically shared a wall. In one house lived Han, a quiet, hard-working man raised by a single mother. In the house right next door lived Nam, also raised by a single mother, alongside his younger brother. Growing up without fathers, the two boys bonded and the two families became incredibly close. They shared meals, helped fix each other's roofs, and practically treated each other like blood relatives. To be honest, that intense closeness was probably the first red flag, you know? Like dominoes just waiting to fall. When the boys grew up, they both found love. Han was dating a sweet, soft-spoken girl named Mi. Nam was deeply involved with a woman named Tia. Nam was the first to propose. But in our culture, you don't just set a date. You consult the astrologers. Both mothers, Nam's and Han's, went together to see a highly respected fortune teller to read Tia's astrological charts. I remember my grandma telling me how the fortune teller looked at the charts, went pale, and gave a stern warning. He said Tia's destiny was completely incompatible with Nam's family. He warned that if Nam brought her into his home, she would usher in a wave of catastrophic bad luck. He called her a calamity. The mothers were terrified and begged Nam to call off the wedding. But Nam was a modern guy. He completely brushed them off, calling the old man a scam artist, and just went ahead and married Tia anyway. He should have listened. Shit, if he had just listened to that one warning, maybe none of this crap would have happened. Just a few months after the wedding, the absolute worst happened. Nam's mother and Han's mother, who were inseparable, took a bus together to a provincial pagoda to do charity work. On the way back, the bus blew a tire on a mountain pass and rolled down a ravine. Both mothers were killed instantly. The neighborhood was devastated. Nam and Hen were shattered. But the bad luck didn't stop there. Exactly 1 year later, Nam's younger brother discovered his wife was having an affair. Completely distraught, he got drunk, jumped on his motorbike, and rode blindly into the night. He was hit by a truck and died on the spot. In the span of a year, Nam had lost his mother and his brother. The neighborhood gossips started whispering immediately. They pointed fingers at Tia, remembering the fortune teller's warning. People were muttering behind closed doors that she was a literal curse who brought the Reaper into that house. But Nam still loved his wife. He ignored the whispers. Han, on the other hand, strictly followed tradition. He mourned his mother for 3 full years before finally marrying me. They moved into Han's house, right next door to Nam and Tia. By this time, Nam's life was spiraling out of control. Desperate to rebuild his family's wealth, he borrowed a massive amount of money to invest in a business venture with a friend. The friend took the money and vanished. Nam was left utterly bankrupt, drowning in debt. The grief and the financial ruin broke him. He started drinking heavily, and when he drank, he needed a punching bag. He blamed Tia. He would scream that the fortune teller was right about her being a curse, and he just started beating her mercilessly. Night after night, my family and I had to listen to the muffled cries and breaking glass echoing through the thin walls, and it honestly made me sick to my stomach, but nobody dared to intervene. After the beatings, Tia would often sneak out to her dark backyard, sit on the dirt, and cry into her hands. Me, living right next door, heard everything. She was a gentle soul. She would quietly slip out of her own back door, step over the low property line, and hold Tia as she cried. Me would stroke her hair, whispering that things would get better, and trying to comfort her however she could. They became incredibly close. They were sisters bonded by proximity and pain. Behind Han and Me's house grew a massive, ancient starfruit tree, planted by Han's late mother. It was huge, its branches thick with sweet yellow fruit. Because the houses were so close, some of the heaviest branches stretched directly over the fence, casting a shadow over Tia's backyard. At first, Tia was incredibly grateful for Me's comfort, but grief and abuse can twist a person's mind. As the months dragged on, Tia's gratitude slowly curdled into a bitter, toxic jealousy. Every time Tia sat in the dirt, nursing bruised ribs, she could hear Han and Me inside their house. She heard Han speaking softly to his wife. She heard Me laughing. Tia's bruised mind started playing tricks on her. She convinced herself that Me wasn't actually comforting her. She decided Me was just pitying her, looking down on her from a pedestal of a happy marriage. The neighborhood already treated Tia like a cursed outcast. Now she felt like the woman next door was mocking her misery. She stopped talking to Me. One sweltering late afternoon, the tension finally snapped. Nam had been drinking since noon. He stumbled home around 4 p.m., immediately demanding things from Tia before slapping her hard across the face, vomiting all over the living room floor, and passing out. Tia, her cheeks stinging and her heart full of absolute rage, had to clean up the vomit. She gathered the soiled clothes and dragged them out to the backyard to scrub them by hand. As she sat on a small plastic stool, furiously scrubbing the clothes, a strong gust of wind blew through the neighborhood. The heavy branches of the starfruit tree above her rustled violently before a dozen overripe starfruits detached from the branches and plummeted down, hitting the concrete of her backyard with sickening wet splatters that burst open and sprayed sticky sweet juice all over the freshly washed clothes she had just spent ages scrubbing. It was a minor inconvenience, but for Tia, it was the final straw. She snapped. She stood up, her face twisted in pure fury, and marched to the low fence dividing the yards. She started screaming at the top of her lungs, demanding that Me come outside immediately. Me rushed out of her back door, wearing an apron, looking alarmed, asking what was wrong. Tia angrily pointed a shaking, soapy finger at the smashed fruit, accusing Me of letting her damn tree ruin her yard and her clothes, screaming about how Me thought her perfect life gave her the right to dump garbage on her. Me immediately softened, her face full of apologies. She desperately promised that she would tell Han to trim those branches this weekend so they wouldn't hang over her yard anymore, begging Tia not to be angry. Me was in the middle of cooking dinner for Han, but seeing Tia's absolute rage, she grabbed a broom from her porch, offering to clean it up for her right then and there. Me hurried toward the low fence, broom in hand. But Tia didn't want apologies. She wanted to hurt someone. She viciously told Me to keep her fake pity to herself, yelling that Me thought she was so much better just because she had a husband who treated her like a queen, while Tia was a slave to this miserable life. As Me approached, trying to calm her down, Tia forcefully shoved her backward. Me tried to plead with her, stumbling backward. Her heel came down squarely on a rotting, slippery starfruit that had fallen on her own patio. Mai's legs shot out from under her. She fell backward, hard and fast. There was a sickening sharp crack as the back of Mai's skull slammed directly into the sharp concrete edge of her own back steps. Mai collapsed onto the patio. She didn't scream. She just laid there, gasping, her eyes wide with shock. A dark, thick pool of blood immediately began to spread rapidly across the gray concrete beneath her head. Tia stood at the fence, frozen. Mai slowly, weakly, raised a trembling hand toward Tia. Her lips moved, but only a wet, gurgling sound came out. She was begging for help. Tia looked at the blood. She looked at Mai's pleading eyes. And in that moment, the jealousy completely consumed her humanity. Tia slowly lowered her hand. She turned her back on the dying woman, walked inside her house, and quietly shut the back door. She left Mai there to bleed to death in the dirt. It pisses me off so much just thinking about it. I mean, what kind of monster just walks away like that? At 6 p.m., Han came home from work. He called out for his wife. The house was quiet, but he smelled something burning on the stove. He turned off the burner and walked out the back door, expecting to see her sweeping the yard. The agonizing, primal scream that tore from Han's throat shattered the quiet evening. Neighbors came running. The police and paramedics arrived with sirens blaring, but it was far too late. The blood had already dried around Mi's head. When the police questioned the neighbors, Tia put on a brilliant performance. She fake cried to the cops, claiming she had been inside the whole time hiding from her drunk husband and hadn't heard a single thing. The police examined the scene. They saw the broom, the squashed starfruit on the patio, the sharp edge of the concrete step. They ruled it a tragic, freak accident, a fatal slip and fall. Han was a broken man. At the funeral, he looked like a hollow shell, weeping uncontrollably over his wife's casket. They had been married for less than a year. 3 nights after the funeral, Han collapsed from exhaustion on the floor right in front of Mi's altar. He had a vivid, terrifying dream. In the dream, he was standing in his living room. The house was pitch black. He heard a soft, muffled sobbing coming from the backyard. He walked out the back door and saw the silhouette of a woman curled into a tight ball, sitting in the dirt directly beneath the starfruit tree. He ran to her, desperately asking if it was her. The woman stopped crying. She slowly stood up and turned around. It was Me. Her face was pale, and the back of her hair was matted with thick, dark blood. Han fell to his knees, reaching out to grab her, sobbing that he thought it was just a nightmare and that he missed her so much. He tried to hug her, but his arms passed through empty air. Me looked down at him, her eyes completely devoid of the warmth he remembered. She told him in this unnaturally echoing whisper that she was dead and that it wasn't an accident. She revealed that Tia had pushed her and then just stood there watching her bleed out and beg for help. Han stared at her in horror. The air around her dropped to a freezing temperature as she hissed that she would never forgive her, promising that she was going to call Tia's name, and the moment she answered, she would drag her down into the dirt with her. As she spoke the final words, the massive starfruit tree above them shook violently. Hundreds of fruits detached simultaneously, raining down on the patio like a barrage of rocks, the deafening thuds echoing right into his waking mind as Han jolted awake, drenched in cold sweat, his heart pounding in his ears. He sat alone in the dark living room, staring at his wife's portrait on the altar. He tried to convince himself it was just grief playing tricks on his mind. Me was dead. Tia was her best friend. It made no sense. But next door, the terror was just beginning. For the first week after the funeral, Tia felt a twisted sense of relief. Her secret was safe, but as the days dragged on, the guilt began to fester. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Mi's wide, pleading eyes and the expanding pool of blood. She stopped sleeping. A week later, Nam came home completely intoxicated around 11 p.m. He beat Tia, cursed at her, threw up on the floor, and passed out on the bed. exhausted and bruised. Tia gathered the soiled clothes and took them out to the backyard to wash them. It was almost midnight. The air was thick and humid. She squatted by the water basin, scrubbing the fabric. The yard was dead silent. Then, she heard it. The heavy, unmistakable sound of starfruits dropping onto the concrete echoed through the dead silence. Tia froze. There was absolutely no wind. She looked up at the branches hanging over the fence. Suddenly, a heavy, ripe starfruit dropped from the highest branch and hit her squarely on the top of the head with a sharp smack. She gasped, dropping the clothes. The fruit rolled onto the concrete at her feet. Then, a voice cut through the humid night air. It was a soft, airy whisper calling out her name over and over again. It sounded like me, but it was elongated, echoing, dripping, with a cold, hollow malice. Tia's blood ran completely cold. She slowly, agonizingly turned her head toward the fence. Standing in the shadows of Han's backyard, directly beneath the massive tree, was a figure. Tia couldn't see the face clearly, but she didn't need to. The silhouette was unmistakable. The voice kept drifting over the fence, asking in this deeply unsettling tone why she wasn't answering. Tia scrambled backward, kicking the water basin over. She scrambled on her hands and knees, practically tearing the back door off its hinges, and threw herself inside the house. She slammed the heavy wooden door shut, threw the deadbolt, and collapsed against it, hyperventilating. She covered her ears, squeezing her eyes shut, desperately trying to gaslight herself into believing it was just the stress and guilt messing with her head, because Me was supposed to be dead. She didn't sleep a wink that night. The next morning, Han had another dream. Me appeared to him again, standing under the tree. She smiled a tight, cold smile. She whispered to him that she had called Tia's name, and although she hadn't answered yet, she promised she would make sure of it. For the next 10 days, Tia lived in a state of absolute paranoia. She refused to go into the backyard after dark. She kept every light in the house blazing until the sun came up. She looked like a walking skeleton, her eyes sunken, her skin gray. Then came the final night. Nam came home late, but surprisingly he wasn't blackout drunk. He was just heavily buzzed. He grumbled a bit, took off his shirt, and climbed into bed. Tia, exhausted beyond human limits, crawled in next to him. Because he hadn't beaten her, her body finally gave out, and she fell into a deep, heavy sleep. Around 3 a.m., the sound woke her up. The agonizing, high-pitched screech of a wooden chair being dragged across the tiled floor of their bedroom sliced right through the silence. Tia's eyes snapped open in the pitch black. She didn't move a muscle. She listened. There was a heavy thud as someone finished dragging the vanity chair away from the desk and sat down right next to her side of the bed. Tia held her breath, her eyes wide with terror, staring at the ceiling. Then, she heard the tapping. Fingernails were drumming rhythmically against the wooden vanity table, tap after tap after tap, growing more and more insistent. The whisper came from right beside her ear, calling her name and asking why she wouldn't just answer. Tia squeezed her eyes shut. She prayed to every god she knew. She bit her lip so hard she tasted blood, desperate not to make a sound. The tapping grew faster, more aggressive. The entity's whisper rapidly escalated into a furious, demanding hiss right next to her head. Next to her, Nam stirred. He was half asleep, annoyed by the noise he barely registered. He didn't open his eyes. He just blindly reached over, slapped Tia hard on the thigh, and grunted. He slurred at her, to just answer whoever the hell was calling her. Tia was paralyzed by fear. The ghost was screaming her name. Her husband was telling her to answer. She was trapped in a nightmare. Nam, getting annoyed at her silence, slapped her thigh again, harder this time. He yelled at her, half asleep, demanding that she answer. The physical pain of the slap broke Tia's concentration. The years of conditioned abuse took over. When her husband demanded something, she answered immediately, or the beatings got worse. Before her conscious mind could stop her, her mouth opened. She whimpered into the dark, saying yes, she was there. The moment the word left her lips, the tapping stopped instantly. From the darkness right beside her bed, Tia heard a low, wet, gurgling laugh. "Got you." Suddenly, two freezing invisible hands clamped down on Tia's shoulders. They gripped her with terrifying, unnatural strength, yanking her violently upright into a sitting position. Tia tried to scream, but the air was instantly sucked from her lungs. She stared into the darkness, her eyes bulging, her jaw locked in a silent scream of absolute, fucking unadulterated terror. Nam drifted back to sleep, oblivious. The next morning, the sun streamed through the bedroom window. Nam woke up, stretching his arms, groaning from a slight hangover. He rolled over to yell at Tia to make him coffee. Tia was lying on her back, staring blindly at the ceiling. Her eyes were completely bloodshot, her mouth frozen in a grotesque, horrific grimace. She was dead. Nam recoiled in horror, screaming for help. When the paramedics arrived, they pronounced her dead at the scene. They noted she had likely suffered a massive, catastrophic heart attack. Fear can literally stop a human heart. But when the coroner tried to move her body, he noticed something strange. Tia's right hand was clenched into a tight, rigor mortis fist. He pried her stiff fingers open one by one. Resting perfectly in the palm of her dead hand was a single, squashed starfruit. When the news spread through the neighborhood, the pieces finally clicked into place. Han remembered his dreams. He realized what Me had meant. He packed his bags, sold his house at a massive loss, and moved away a week later. Nem, unable to live in the house where his wife died of sheer terror, abandoned his property entirely. The two houses sat empty, rotting away under the brutal tropical sun. Locals claimed that if you walked past the alleyway at night, you could look through the rusted gates and see the faint silhouette of a woman standing beneath the massive branches of the starfruit tree, waiting patiently. Eventually, the massive tree withered and died, its roots rotting in the blood-soaked soil. And only then did the quiet finally return to the neighborhood.